In the quiet town of Bridgewater Falls, 70-year-old Vietnam veteran David Anderson never imagined that a simple morning at his favorite diner would trigger a showdown that would change the entire community. When the notorious Iron Fist motorcycle gang destroyed David's wheelchair, his lifeline to independence, they believed they'd found an easy target. What they didn't realize was that his son was an elite Navy SEAL with over 200 successful missions under his belt. What began as petty intimidation quickly spiraled into a battle for the soul of Bridgewater Falls, unearthing a sinister criminal network operating in the shadows. From tense confrontations on deserted roads to stealth surveillance of a hidden warehouse, father and son joined forces to protect the town and bring the Iron Fist to justice. Even as the gang rallied reinforcements and threatened anyone who stood in their way, David's unwavering determination and his son's formidable training proved that true strength lies not in a show of force, but in the resolve to defend what's right. Through firefights that lit up the night sky and perilous face-offs against ruthless enforcers, every harrowing moment revealed just how far the Iron Fist's influence stretched. Yet, in each instance, the Anderson family refused to yield, inspiring neighbors, old friends, and even law enforcement to unite against a common threat. By the time the dust settled and sirens faded, this once peaceful town had discovered its hidden courage and learned the unbreakable power of family. In a single, life-altering stand against a deadly conspiracy, David Anderson proved that sacrifice and loyalty are stronger than any outlaw's roar. This is the remarkable story of how one veteran's fight for dignity sparked a revolution in a community that refused to surrender. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The morning light in Bridgewater Falls was something out of a painting, golden rays cascading over the rolling hills, the dew-kissed grass shimmering like emeralds, and the tall oak trees standing like silent watchers along the main road. But behind this picturesque calm lurked the disquiet that came whenever the Iron Fist motorcycle gang revved their engines too close to the heart of town. David Anderson had lived in Bridgewater Falls for the better part of 30 years. He arrived soon after his last tour in Vietnam, looking for someplace small and peaceful to call home. Over time, he had become a beloved figure in the community. Some of the older residents still remembered a time when he walked without the support of steel or rubber. Yet for most of those who knew him now, David was the kind soul rolling through the hardware store, the pharmacy, or Emma's family restaurant, a grin creasing his weathered face. A face carved with lines and stories he rarely spoke about. On this particular morning, David's worn hands guided his wheelchair along the cracked sidewalk leading to Emma's as he did every Tuesday at precisely 8 o'clock. The wheelchair was reinforced with extra cushioning on the seat, spinal problems made it uncomfortable to ride for too long, and a small mount for his cane that hung along the right side. But David prided himself on not needing the cane most of the time. He managed fine with his strong arms and that battered old wheelchair that had taken him anywhere he needed to go for nearly a decade. The sign outside Emma's family restaurant squeaked in the gentle wind. A small bell jingled over the door as David maneuvered inside. The interior smelled of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and warm biscuits. Pale morning light came through the large front window, illuminating the cozy space. A few local patrons nursed their coffees in corners, while Emma, an older woman with curly gray hair and a perpetual smile, moved behind the counter. "Morning, David," Emma called, setting down a mug for him at his usual table. "I already got the coffee going. How's the back treating you today?" David gave his trademark shrug. "About as good as can be expected, Emma. It'll hold together." She knew to leave it at that. David rarely complained about his pains, be they physical or otherwise. He gave a grateful nod and wheeled over to his table near the front window so he could watch the town wake up. He was stirring some cream into his coffee when the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles echoed down the street. A subtle tension entered the restaurant. The man at the next table, an older farmer named Mark, sipped more aggressively at his drink. Two younger women by the counter exchanged concerned glances. Even Emma stopped wiping the countertop and turned her eyes toward the window as the gang's bikes rolled past, thick tires rumbling against the pavement. The Iron Fist motorcycle gang had moved into the area about 6 months earlier, turning an old warehouse on the edge of town into their makeshift clubhouse. The sheriff had tried to keep them in check at first, but the gang quickly proved that they had little regard for authority. What started as small scuffles soon escalated into intimidation tactics, bar fights, and petty theft. The rumor mill suggested they trafficked in far worse, but no one had proven anything yet. David did his best to ignore them. They rarely paid him any mind anyway. A handful of times he'd seen them glare in his direction, sneers on their faces as if daring him to say something. But for the most part, they found easier targets, people who actually seemed afraid or maybe had businesses they could extort. David was just an old disabled veteran in a rickety wheelchair. What could he offer them besides a sense of cheap cruelty? Still, as the roar of the bikes died down, Emma shook her head in disapproval. Riding this early in the day, she muttered quietly. Not even letting folks have their morning coffee in peace. David offered a wry smile. That's the nature of bullies. They like making sure everyone knows they're around. I'll still enjoy my coffee regardless. Emma nodded, pouring him a fresh top-off. I'll get your eggs and toast started. He murmured his thanks, taking a sip and letting the warmth of the coffee flow through him. Outside, the gang members slowed their bikes to a crawl, the noise subsiding to a dull growl. David kept his gaze on them out of the corner of his eye. 6 men in all, each wearing the Iron Fist's patch on the back of a leather vest, a curled fist clutching a vicious-looking chain. They parked their bikes in front of Emma's, exchanging a few glances. It was unusual for them to come here so early. Typically, the Iron Fist members preferred rowdier, late-night haunts, not quiet mom-and-pop breakfast joints. The biggest man in the group swung off his bike. David recognized him, a towering figure with a shaved head and a handlebar mustache. People whispered that this was Jax, the new president of the Iron Fist. He directed the others with nods and a grunt that indicated they should spread out. 2 of them sauntered down the block, while Jax and the remaining 3 strolled directly toward Emma's entrance. David forced himself not to tense. They had the right to eat here, same as anyone. But the looks on their faces suggested they had no intention of casually sipping coffee. Jax yanked the door open. The bell jingled unnaturally loud in the silence that fell over the restaurant. Howdy, folks, Jax called, his voice dripping with that mocking brand of politeness that set everyone's teeth on edge. Don't mind us. Just passing through. The corners of his mouth curled into a wicked smirk. One of the gang members, a rangy fellow with a scar across his cheek, glared at Emma behind the counter. He held out a tattooed hand. We'll take some coffee, old lady. And don't keep us waiting. Emma swallowed, her expression firm though her eyes flickered with worry. Of course, she said. Take a seat and I'll bring coffee. The 4 bikers glanced around as though weighing whether they might like to cause trouble or settle down. Jax's gaze landed on David. For a moment, there was a flicker of interest in his otherwise flat eyes. Morning, David said, still stirring his coffee, trying to keep his voice even. The big man just grunted, then strolled to an unoccupied booth. The others crowded around him. Emma, trembling slightly, went to prepare more coffee, and the rest of the patrons shrank against their seats, wanting no part of a confrontation. David tried to refocus on his breakfast. The local radio station played a subdued tune overhead. He heard Emma at the counter, her voice barely a whisper, the word cream drifting in the air as she tried to confirm how they wanted their coffee. He couldn't make out all their responses, but the bark of laughter following Emma's small question made him uneasy. He remembered how quickly things could escalate when testosterone and intimidation were on the menu. He'd been in too many places like that, Saigon back in the day, the back alleys of Da Nang when tensions were high and one wrong word could get you a bullet in the chest. War never left you the same, and in a tiny town like Bridgewater Falls, you valued every scrap of peace you could get. That was all David wanted, quiet days and restful nights. But the Iron Fist obviously thrived on the opposite, as if chaos were their fuel. David kept his eyes down, hoping the bikers would gulp their coffee and roll on down the road. However, an uneasy half-hour went by and they continued to lounge in their booth, occasionally tossing out rude comments at Emma or one of the other diners. When David finished his eggs, Emma slipped over to him discreetly. I'm sorry, David, she whispered, but they're scaring away my customers. People keep leaving early. I don't know what to do. He patted her arm. You're not alone, he said softly. We'll get through it. If they cause real trouble, call the sheriff. She sighed, looking toward the phone behind the counter. I hope it doesn't come to that. There was a light jingle at the door as a few more customers decided it was best to leave. David felt a pang of guilt in his chest. Emma's restaurant was her livelihood and a beloved gathering spot for the whole town. Watching it empty out because of a few bullies riled his temper. Still, he remained calm, finishing his coffee, hoping that patience and ignoring them might resolve the problem. But the moment he paid his check and started wheeling toward the door, Jax abruptly stood from the booth. David halted just as he reached for the handle. Leaving already? Jax's voice thundered across the space. David turned his wheelchair around. I've got errands, he replied steadily. The big man took slow, deliberate steps across the wooden floor. His eyes flicked down to David's wheelchair, then up at David's face. Saw you giving me looks earlier, Jax growled. Got something to say to me? Or maybe you're just used to minding other people's business. I heard rumors about some cripple vet who thinks he runs this town. David's grip on his wheel treads tightened. I don't think I run anything, he answered. Just an old guy who wants a quiet breakfast. Quiet breakfast, Jax mocked, exchanging glances with his men who had fanned out behind him. Well, we like quiet too, until somebody stares. We don't appreciate being stared at. David was about to respond when Emma spoke up from behind the counter. He wasn't staring, sir. He's been coming here for years. Just let him be and Shut your mouth, Jax snapped, turning so sharply that Emma stepped back. And bring me the check. He paused, glanced around, then refocused on David. As for you. He took another step forward and David involuntarily leaned back in his chair. Jax's presence was overwhelming. But David had faced bigger threats in his life. He refused to show the fear that threatened to creep into his chest. Just let me pass, David said, his tone steady and low. Jax chuckled, shaking his head in mock sadness. Look at this tough old man. I bet you used to carry a rifle or something, right? Shoot a bunch of folks in Nam. David didn't flinch at the mention of Vietnam. He'd heard it all before. A mixture of respect from some, pity from others, and contempt from a select few who had no understanding of what war actually was. I served, David said simply. And I'm proud I did. A sardonic grin stretched across Jax's face. Oh, I'm sure you are. Well, now you can serve me by learning some respect. The hulking biker reached out and smacked his palm on the top of David's wheelchair, sending a metallic clang through the room. Without missing a beat, David pressed a hidden latch on the wheelchair's arm to lock its brakes and braced his feet against the ground. The wheels no longer spun. He glared up, forcing the anger out of his voice. Back off. Jax barked a laugh. Or what, old man? You gonna run me over? His men snickered. One called out, I think the old vet wants to chase after you, boss. Jax gave a nod to the man, then turned back to David. You know, we don't like feeling disrespected. And I sure don't like your tone. Every nerve in David's body screamed at him to avoid an altercation. He might have had training decades ago, but those days were behind him. And with his spinal injury, any physical confrontation could be disastrous. Still, something deeper within him, pride or maybe a sense of righteous anger, wouldn't let him cower. Quietly, David replied, I'm asking you nicely. Let me leave. Jax suddenly shoved David's wheelchair, sending it sliding backward. David's arms scrambled to keep control. A hiss of shock and fear ran through the onlookers. Emma was on the verge of calling out again, but she saw the manic look in Jax's eye and froze. David's heart pounded. The memory of mortar shells and nighttime raids flickered in his mind like a dark mosaic of half-buried nightmares. He reminded himself this wasn't a war zone. Yet these men clearly had no respect for the law. Or for a disabled vet. David inhaled, trying to steady himself. What do you want? He asked, voice low and calm. I want you to apologize, Jax said, his tone almost friendly. I want you to say you're sorry for staring and for thinking you're better than us. Then maybe I'll let you out that door. It took David a moment. He was trembling internally. But the line between fear and dignity was razor thin, and he knew which side he wanted to stand on. I'm not apologizing for doing nothing wrong. There was a tense silence. Jax's eyes narrowed, then he slowly smiled. Stubborn old dog. That's fine. Have it your way. He turned to his men. Boys, he said, why don't we escort him out? Show him a bit of respect. A lean biker with a snake tattoo on his neck approached, looking all too pleased to fulfill Jax's order. He yanked David's wheelchair, spinning him around so forcefully that one of the front casters lifted off the ground for a moment. David's heart hammered. Before he could protest, the biker was pushing him to the door where another one of the gang members opened it. The abrupt movement sent David's coffee mug crashing off a nearby table, the shards scattering across the floor. Emma shouted, "Stop it," but her words fell on deaf ears. The sunshine outside felt harsh compared to the dim interior of the restaurant. David squinted, bracing his hands on the wheelchair's armrests as they shoved him down the short ramp. The gang's motorcycles were lined up along the curb, a menacing row of chrome and steel. Snake Tattoo grinned down at David. "Let's see just how tough this old chair is." He looked over his shoulder to Jax for approval, who nodded once, a cruel grin playing at his lips. That was all the incentive the henchman needed. Before David could even wheel away, the man kicked the side of the wheelchair, aiming at the brake mechanism. The blow reverberated up through David's arms. Another biker stepped forward, booting the other side. Metal groaned and bent. David's mind reeled. This was his lifeline, his only way to get around, and these men were savagely attacking it. He tried to maneuver backward, but the brakes jammed. The third biker joined in, unleashing a series of furious kicks that made the chair shudder. The small crowd of townspeople who had been walking by stopped, horrified, a few pulling out phones to record or call the sheriff. "Stop!" David yelled, hearing a tinge of desperation in his own voice. Memories of Vietnam rocket attacks stormed in his mind, the sounds of metal twisting under extreme force. Except this time, the sound wasn't enemy artillery. It was the destructive fury of these bikers on a wheelchair that had served David faithfully for years. He tried to protect the chair with his body, but a heavy hand shoved him onto the sidewalk, making him sprawl across the cement. Pain lanced up his spine, forcing a groan from his lungs. The bikers laughed at his agony as they turned their full attention to the wheelchair. David could only watch in helpless rage as they stomped and battered it, one of them actually ripping off the seat cushion. Another grabbed the cane from its clip on the side and snapped it over his knee as though it were kindling. Twisted metal, broken rubber wheels, and shattered plastic littered the sidewalk by the time they finished. The last to strike landed a vicious kick, sending what was left of the seat frame skittering across the concrete. David lay there, breathing hard, the shock of pain making his vision swim. They had destroyed his mobility in just a matter of seconds, an act that left him feeling violated on a level he hadn't anticipated. Anger simmered, then roared in his blood. He tried to push himself upright, but the stinging in his back knocked him back down. Jax stood over him, blocking out the sun. "Still feel like not apologizing?" The big man shook his head like he couldn't believe David's gall. David's breath hissed between his teeth, his heart pounding. He couldn't even form the words. "Coward," Jax spat, then he kicked one of the twisted pieces of the wheelchair, sending it clattering. "You're nothing. Just another cripple who doesn't know his place." David tried again to speak, but found only a gasp. The crowd around them seemed paralyzed, unsure how to intervene against four dangerous bikers. One older man had a trembling phone in his hand, presumably calling for help. Another onlooker tried to step forward, but was warded off by a glare from one of Jax's men. Finally, Jax tossed a glance back at the restaurant where Emma was half in the doorway, horror on her face. "We'll be back," Jax told her. Then he turned to David again. "Get used to the view from the pavement, old man." With that, he and his crew mounted their bikes, engines snarling. A chorus of revs filled the air, drowning out the soft moans that escaped David's lips. Then they tore off down the street, leaving the battered remains of the wheelchair behind. It took a few onlookers' help to get David upright. His wrists and elbows were scraped, small droplets of blood soaking his sleeves. But his back was the biggest concern. Any abrupt jarring could wreck him for days, even weeks. Yet all David could think about was the twisted pile of metal on the sidewalk. A sense of disorientation swirled in his mind. He felt both the humiliation of being forcibly knocked out of his chair and the sudden wave of helplessness at losing a basic necessity for independence. Emma hurried out, tears in her eyes. "David, oh my God. Are you okay?" He grimaced, allowing her and another patron to guide him to a bench near the restaurant door. "Been better," he rasped. "I think I need to lie down." "We'll get you to the clinic," said a tall man who worked at the hardware store down the block, helping maneuver David with gentle care. "I've got my truck right here." "Thank you, Bill," David mumbled. His gaze drifted one last time to his destroyed wheelchair, and the rush of helplessness almost choked him. Just get me upright, please." The ride to the local clinic felt like an eternity, each bump in the road jostling David's back. He grit his teeth to keep from crying out. At the clinic, the staff recognized him instantly. "Mr. Anderson, what happened?" and whisked him into a small examination room to check for broken bones or any new spinal injuries. Once he'd been examined and given some pain meds, he found himself propped in a bed, staring at the ceiling tiles. His mind seethed with the memory of Jax's mocking grin. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on the rhythmic beep of the clinic's monitors to calm himself. He could almost hear his younger self telling him to stay frosty, keep your head clear. That was the soldier in him trying to override the fresh wave of anger and shame. Eventually, Emma came to see him, relief etched in every line of her face. "Doctor said you'll be okay," she murmured, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Just gotta be careful for a bit." David swallowed, nodding. "Thank you." A thickness caught in his throat as he thought about the future. He had a backup wheelchair at home, but it was old, outdated, and barely serviceable. The one that had been destroyed had cost him dearly. Insurance was a tangle of red tape he didn't want to face yet. And even if he managed to get another, that wasn't the point. They had taken something irreplaceable, his sense of autonomy. Emma seemed to read his mind. She smiled softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'll help with anything you need. So will half the town, I'm sure. Don't worry about that." A lump formed in David's throat, but he just nodded in gratitude. Another wave of fear and anger passed through him as he realized that if the Iron Fist did this once, they could do it again. There was no reason to think they'd stop now that they'd found a vulnerable target. The knowledge of that vulnerability had always been there, but it hadn't seemed real until this moment. His gaze drifted to the phone on the bedside table. He hesitated, then carefully lifted it, dialing a number he rarely used. Each ring on the other end sent a tremor of uncertainty through him. Would the number even be the same? Would that voice pick up? Then came the click of an answered call, followed by a warm, familiar tone. "Hello?" David's voice trembled slightly. "Son." A pause. "Dad? What's going on? You sound off. Is everything okay?" David gripped the phone tighter, feeling a wave of relief wash over him just hearing his son's voice. "I need you," he managed to say, summoning more strength. "I'm in trouble here. Got some folks making life tough. They destroyed my wheelchair, son. Attacked me." A beat of silence, then his son's voice grew cold, steady, the voice of a man who had known intense conflict. "Who did it?" David tried to keep from choking on his words. "Some local gang. They call themselves Iron Fist. I didn't want to bother you, but..." "You're not bothering me," his son said, voice tight. "I'll be on the next plane out, Dad. Hang in there. I promise you, this will be handled." David exhaled slowly, fighting tears. "Thank you, David Jr. Sorry, I know you've got a busy schedule, your missions and all." "No mission is more important than protecting you," came the firm reply. "I'm coming. Sit tight." Relief and dread mingled in David's chest. His son was a trained Navy SEAL, a man who'd seen the ugliest sides of humanity in countless deployments. That skill could be a blessing or a curse. David didn't want violence, but something in him also craved justice. When he hung up, Emma gently squeezed his shoulder, her voice quiet. "Your son's on his way?" David gave a small nod. "Yes," he said, staring at the ceiling. And the Iron Fist just made a very big mistake. Though the pain meds dulled the throbbing in his back, a new spark had been lit inside him. He wondered if the bikers had any idea whom they had just provoked. The old man in the wheelchair wasn't the real threat to them. That threat was his son, a man who had survived things far worse than a gang of thugs with too much testosterone and too few brains. He almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But not quite. Outside, the sun continued its slow climb across the sky, shining unknowing light on the small town of Bridgewater Falls, a town about to see a clash that would change its people forever. And as David closed his eyes, drifting into a medicated rest, he couldn't help but feel a cold sense of inevitability. His son was coming. And for the Iron Fist, the time for peace was almost up. The plane touched down at the nearest major airport to Bridgewater Falls late in the day, the terminal half empty as travelers hurried through to claim baggage or make connecting flights. Among them walked David Anderson Jr., though to everyone outside his family he was simply Anderson, or in his Navy SEAL team often just Axe, a nickname he'd acquired early in his career for reasons he seldom discussed. His posture was erect and purposeful, scanning the environment the way a panther scans the jungle. A few random observers might notice the sharpness in his gaze or the set of his jaw and assume he was some sort of off-duty law enforcement or ex-military. They would be correct, but they would never guess the depth of his experience. 200 successful combat missions across multiple deployments, ranging from direct action raids to counterterrorism operations. His chest bore the invisible weight of that service. He carried a single duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Inside were clothes, a shaving kit, and a few items of gear he always traveled with: a well-worn combat knife, a small medical kit, and a sheathed throwing hatchet that had earned him his call sign. He never liked being unprepared, even when coming home. As he stepped onto the escalator leading down to the arrivals area, he felt his phone buzzing in his pocket. A quick glance showed a text from the local hospital number. "Dad is stable. Waiting for you." Relief prickled through him, followed quickly by the ember of anger that had ignited the moment he learned what had happened. He recalled the trembling in his father's voice when he'd called. In all his 30 years, he had rarely heard his father sound vulnerable. Even when that old wheelchair needed repairs or the winter cold made his back pain flare, David Sr. had always spoken with a resilient tone, never wanting to be a burden. The voice on the phone the other day had been different, pained, defeated. That was unacceptable to Anderson. As soon as he cleared the final corridor, he spotted a lanky man in a baseball cap holding a hand-scribbled sign that read, "Anderson." The man was Bill, the same hardware store employee who had helped his father into the truck after the attack. The moment Bill recognized the tall figure approaching him, his face broke into a relieved grin. "You're David's boy, right?" Bill said, lowering the sign. "That's right. Just call me Anderson," came the quiet reply. "Sure thing. Name's Bill Marsh. I'm, well, sort of a neighbor. I was there when your father got hurt." The man's voice faltered, eyes filled with shame. I wish I could have done more." Anderson placed a reassuring hand on Bill's shoulder. "You helped him get medical care. That's more than these bullies would have done. Thank you." With a nod, Bill led him to a dusty pickup truck parked outside. Anderson tossed his duffel in the back and slid into the passenger seat, mentally taking note of the surroundings. He asked Bill a few direct questions: how many men had attacked his father, what were their immediate threats, and how the rest of the town was reacting. Bill answered as best he could, describing Jax's imposing presence and the willingness of his henchmen to destroy an old man's wheelchair. The rage in Anderson's chest smoldered. They drove for an hour through winding country roads, past fields and quiet hamlets, before arriving in Bridgewater Falls. The sun dipped behind the rolling hills, painting the sky in broad strokes of pink and orange. Anderson studied the peaceful landscape, feeling that uncanny tension whenever something looked too calm. An entire war could be fought in a place like this if the wrong people decided to tear it apart. And from what he'd heard, the Iron Fist were well on their way to claiming a piece of this town. Bill dropped him at the small local clinic, exchanging phone numbers in case Anderson needed anything further. "Good luck," Bill offered, sincerity thick in his voice, "and give your old man my best." Anderson nodded, then stepped out of the truck. Night was falling fast, and the clinic's fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow on the parking lot. As he entered, a middle-aged nurse at the reception desk looked up. "Can I help? Oh, you must be Mr. Anderson's son. Follow me." Within moments, Anderson stood in a small hospital room. David Sr. was propped up on pillows, looking exhausted but no longer in acute pain. It took all of Anderson's discipline not to rush to his father's side like a worried child, but instead he moved close with quiet grace, placing a hand on the older man's arm. "How are you feeling, Dad?" he asked, his voice low. A wave of relief passed across David Sr.'s features and he mustered a weary smile. "Better now that you're here," he admitted. "They've got me on some pain meds. Doc says I'll be all right, just gotta rest a few days." Lower back took a beating, though. Anderson exhaled, letting the tension loosen in his chest. "I'll take you home when they clear you. In the meantime, I want a full account of what happened." David Sr. started recounting the events in a measured tone. Every so often he paused, swallowing a lump in his throat as he remembered the humiliating details, jacks towering above him, the sickening crunch of twisted metal, the blow that sent him sprawling. Anderson listened intently, nodding at intervals, eyes darkening with each detail. His father finished by mentioning that the gang had threatened to return, telling Emma and the townspeople they'd be back to keep everyone in line. A quick rap at the door interrupted them. Emma poked her head in, relief flooding her face when she saw Anderson. "Goodness, you made it," she breathed, stepping inside. She held a plastic grocery bag which she set on the small bedside table. "I brought some homemade soup, David, in case you're sick of hospital food." Anderson smiled politely, though his mind was still on the iron fist. "Thank you for looking after my father." Emma waved a dismissive hand. "He's looked after us plenty over the years. Least I can do." Then she turned fully to Anderson, seeming both curious and a bit nervous. "Word around town is that you're, in the Navy?" "Anderson's a SEAL," David Sr. said, a hint of pride slipping through his voice, even though he rarely boasted about his son. Emma's eyes widened. "Oh, that's impressive. I can't say I know much about that, but I can guess it means you can handle a few punks on motorcycles." Anderson gave a single nod, expression grim. "I'll do whatever needs to be done. But I also don't want to see more violence in this town." Emma sighed, glancing at David Sr., a fair dream, but I think we're past that. The Iron Fist have been scaring folks left and right. If the sheriff can't handle them, we might need that sort of determination. But it's not my call. I'm just worried about my restaurant and about David getting around. A pang of frustration hit Anderson. "I'll see to it that he gets a replacement chair. And that you can run your restaurant without fear. That's a promise." The older woman smiled hopefully, the worry lines still etched her face. "I'll let you two talk. Just be careful. They're dangerous." Anderson walked Emma to the door, then turned back to his father. He sat in the plastic chair beside the bed, a fierce calm in his eyes. "Dad, how did this gang get such a foothold here? Wasn't Sheriff Crenshaw on top of this?" David Sr. sighed, closing his eyes briefly. "Crenshaw's old. He tries, but rumor is these guys aren't just passing through. They've got some bigger operation, maybe drugs or something worse, in the next county. They're entrenched enough that the local deputies are outgunned. People are scared to speak up. Doesn't help that some folks suspect they've bribed a deputy or two, though I can't confirm that." Anderson pressed his lips together. Corruption and intimidation, familiar tactics from half the war zones he'd visited. "All right," he said quietly. "First thing tomorrow, I'm heading over to your house. I'll get that backup wheelchair you mentioned, make sure it's functional, and bring it here so you can move around. Then we'll figure out the next step." An uneasy laugh escaped David Sr.'s throat. "That old backup's from the Stone Age. Might as well be a wagon wheel." "We'll adapt," Anderson replied, shrugging. "Just like you taught me." His father's eyes misted a little. He reached for Anderson's hand. "I'm sorry I had to call you away from your duties. I know how important your missions are." "Nothing is more important than family," Anderson said firmly. "You taught me that too." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the beep of the medical monitor the only sound. Then David Sr. let out a long breath. "I just wish it hadn't come to this. After Vietnam, I promised myself I'd never get tangled in violence again. And now, I brought you into it." "You didn't bring me into it," Anderson corrected, his voice soft but unyielding. "They did when they destroyed your chair. I'm just here to make sure they realize they made the worst mistake of their lives." A heavy pause. David Sr. recognized the steel in his son's gaze, the quiet resolve that came with being a seasoned special operator. He swallowed, wondering for a moment if he should be afraid for the gang members rather than the other way around. At length, David Sr. nodded and leaned back into the pillows. "All right, son. I'll leave it to you. But try not to do anything that'll get you locked up." "No promises," Anderson said, a hint of a half-smile. "But I'll do my best to keep it clean." The next morning dawned cool and clear. Anderson left the clinic early, making the short trek across town to his father's bungalow. Bridgewater Falls was quiet at daybreak, the only activity being the occasional dog walker or a city worker collecting trash along the main street. When Anderson reached his father's property, a neat, single-story home with a small front porch, he noted the well-tended garden, the American flag fluttering from the porch post, and the wheelchair ramp by the side entrance. The door was locked, but Dad had given him a key long ago. Inside, the place smelled faintly of old books and the lingering aroma of coffee. He located the spare wheelchair in a back closet. Dust coated its surfaces and the wheels squeaked ominously when he tested them. Definitely not in good shape. Still, he had a set of basic tools in his duffel and quickly performed a makeshift tune-up, oiling the wheels and tightening bolts. It wasn't perfect, but it would serve until they could get a proper replacement. Anderson was about to leave when he noticed a shoebox near the closet. It was labeled Vietnam, and curiosity nagged at him. He hesitated, then gently slid it open. Inside were faded photographs, a younger David Sr. in uniform grinning alongside fellow soldiers, black and white images of the base in Saigon, a snapshot of a helicopter with the door gunner perched, scanning the horizon. On top of the photos was a folded letter, text unreadable without unfolding it. With a soft breath, Anderson closed the box. He knew his father's memories of the war were complicated, mingled pride, sorrow, and regret. No point digging into it without permission. He placed the box back on the shelf and carried the wheelchair outside. Once it was in the trunk of a borrowed sedan, Emma had offered him her car. He set off toward the clinic. As he drove, a flash of motion down a side street caught his eye. Two motorcycles roared past, both sporting the iron fist patch. Anderson's jaw tightened. They were out and about even in the morning. He considered following them, but decided his first priority was to get the chair to his dad. Confrontations could wait. Besides, he needed more information, numbers, hideouts, any local informants, before engaging. Acting blindly would get him nowhere. At the clinic, Anderson found the morning nurse opening the blinds to let in the sunshine. She recognized him and nodded with a polite smile. "Your father's awake. Room 3A. He wheeled the chair up to the second-floor corridor, maneuvered through the hallway, and entered his father's room. David Sr. was sitting up, gingerly stretching his arms. His face lit with relief when he saw the spare chair. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he joked. "Better than being stuck in this bed." Anderson chuckled, rolling the squeaky chair over. "Let's see if you can move from one squeak machine to another." Carefully, with assistance from a nurse, David Sr. transferred from the bed to the chair. He made a face at the squealing sound the wheels emitted. "Yeah, that's nostalgic. Reminds me of the first one I had after the war." "Thanks, son." He glanced up, gratitude shining in his eyes. Anderson placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We'll get you a better one soon. But for now, at least you're not stuck in bed." The older man nodded, looking relieved just to have the option of mobility again. "Doctor says I can go home tomorrow if all checks out. I just need to rest." "That means no more biker fights in the meantime," he added wryly. Anderson lifted an eyebrow. "I'll do my best to contain any fights." The father's expression grew serious. "Son, be careful. These men are vicious. And I don't think they'll hesitate to come after me or you if they feel threatened." A flicker of something hardened in Anderson's gaze. "Good," he said quietly, "because I want them to feel threatened. Keeps them off balance." He was about to elaborate when the door swung open. A uniformed figure stepped in, Sheriff Crenshaw, a man in his late 50s, gray-haired and somewhat haggard around the edges. He carried himself with the fatigue of someone who'd been fighting a losing battle against the gang for months. "Mr. Anderson," Crenshaw greeted, tipping his hat at David Sr. Then he turned to Anderson Jr. "I presume you're the son?" Anderson nodded, standing from his seat. "Yes, sir." Crenshaw extended a hand. "Sheriff Abel Crenshaw. I'm sorry about what happened here. We're doing our best to clamp down on those iron fist creeps." David Sr. gave a sour chuckle. "Too little, too late, Sheriff. A pained expression crossed Crenshaw's face. "I know you're frustrated, and I'm sorry about that. But we're dealing with a group that's bigger and better armed than what we're used to. They've got chapters in other states, connections we can't fully track. We're trying to coordinate with state police, but it's slow going." Anderson studied the sheriff. "Understood. So you're telling us that you can't keep my father safe on your own?" A flash of pride and guilt flickered in Crenshaw's eyes. "I'm telling you that if you go vigilante, it could complicate things. We need to handle this the lawful way. If you have a lead or if you see them, call us immediately. We'll respond." "And how fast is that response time?" Anderson pressed, careful to keep the challenge in his voice restrained. "When my father was attacked, I'm told it took your deputy nearly an hour to arrive." Crenshaw's face flushed. "We're understaffed and dealing with multiple calls. But I promise you, we're doing what we can." David Sr. shook his head. "Abel, no offense, but these men left me in the street. They threatened Emma, they threatened the town, and they're only growing bolder. I'm worried. We can't wait months for the state to sort this out." The sheriff sighed heavily. "I understand. Trust me. We've got to proceed carefully or else we'll blow any legal case we might build against them. I came by to take your statement, David, so we can press charges. If you could help us identify the men who attacked you." "It was Jax," David Sr. said, voice grim. "Their ringleader. And 3 of his flunkies. Didn't catch names, but I could point them out on sight." Crenshaw scribbled notes in a small notebook. "I'll add that to our file. We'll see if we can get some warrants. But these guys know how to vanish when we come knocking." Anderson spoke up. "If you locate them, I'd appreciate being informed. Until then, I'll be around making sure Dad's safe." Crenshaw eyed him cautiously. "Stay within the law, son." Anderson didn't blink. "I protect my family. That's the law of the land as far as I'm concerned." A tense moment passed, then Crenshaw gave a curt nod. "All right, I'll keep you updated. And, David, once you're discharged, we'll have an officer swing by your place to it." "To do what, exactly?" David Sr. interrupted, though not unkindly. "We'll at least do a patrol in the area. Keep an eye out." Crenshaw's voice was measured. "You have my word, I'm doing everything I can." With that, the sheriff tipped his hat again and left the room, leaving an uneasy silence behind. Anderson's jaw muscle twitched in frustration. They can't stop the Iron Fist. Not with the resources they have. David Sr. sighed. "Maybe not. But you can't take on the whole gang by yourself either." Anderson said nothing, but the look in his eyes hinted he might try. He took a deep breath as if recentering himself. "I'll gather intel. I'll find out where they hole up, how many of them there are, who's truly calling the shots. Then I'll figure out a plan." The directness of his voice echoed the discipline he'd learned through years of training. His father recognized that tone. The same one that came out whenever Anderson briefed him about a recent deployment, calm, methodical, unshakable. A part of David Sr. felt pride welling up, another part felt fear. War was no place for a man's home. And yet here they were, about to engage in a private little war in Bridgewater Falls unless fate intervened. Outside the clinic window, the sun shone brightly, oblivious to the tension building in this small town. People went about their day, shopping for groceries, tending to gardens, sipping coffee at Emma's. But the Iron Fist was out there, engines revving, forging plans of their own. And Anderson knew that once men like that showed their teeth, they rarely backed down. He gently squeezed his father's shoulder again. "Get some rest, Dad. You'll need your strength. Tonight, I'll do a bit of recon around town." He smiled grimly. "Maybe I'll pay those bikers a friendly visit." David Sr. inhaled, wanting to caution him. But he saw the resolve set in Anderson's eyes. There was no turning back. The wheels of conflict had been set in motion the moment the Iron Fist laid hands on David Sr.'s wheelchair. "Just come back in one piece," David Sr. whispered. Anderson bowed his head. "I will." A subtle hush fell over the clinic corridor as he left. The tension in the air had the faint taste of a thunderstorm about to break. The Iron Fist had chosen their victim poorly. Now they would learn that real strength doesn't always come with an engine's roar or a gang's colors. It can arrive in the silent step of a single determined warrior. Outside, Anderson climbed into Emma's car once more, driving slowly through the streets. He scanned the road, side alleys, store windows, each corner of the quiet downtown. People recognized him as David Sr.'s son, giving polite waves. He responded in kind, but his mind was a steel trap of focus. About 10 blocks from the clinic, he spotted a pair of bikes parked outside a rundown bar named Red Charlie's. The paint was chipped off the sign, the windows tinted with grime. A huge logo for some beer brand was plastered near the entrance. The bikes bore the Iron Fist patch on the seatbacks. Anderson pulled over discreetly, stepping out to observe from across the street. The midday sun glinted off the bike's chrome. He studied them for a good 10 minutes, but the owners never emerged. Finally, Anderson decided to move on. He strolled a short distance down the block, peering inside other businesses, mentally mapping out vantage points. If the Iron Fist used Red Charlie's as one of their hangouts, he wanted to know every detail. He was on his way back to the car when he felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, eyes on him. Sure enough, emerging from a nearby alley came a biker sporting the Iron Fist vest, a wiry man with a shaved head and a chain dangling from one fist. The man's eyes narrowed at Anderson. "You lost, pal?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. His posture radiated the kind of cocky aggression that came from being feared by everyone around him. Anderson paused, letting no emotion show on his face. "Just taking a walk." The biker cocked his head, stepping closer. His chain clanked. "Huh, not a local, are you?" "Visiting family," Anderson replied evenly. He didn't step back or flinch. The man eyed him up and down, noticing Anderson's athletic build. "Family, you wouldn't be that old cripple's kid, would you?" A sneer tugged at his lips. Anderson felt the rage flare inside, but kept it leashed. "I think you should walk away now," he said quietly, making his stance clear without raising his voice. The biker gave a short laugh. "What if I don't?" Anderson's eyes flicked to the chain. "Then you'll have a very bad day." A moment passed, tension crackling. The biker's sneer faltered slightly, something about Anderson's quiet confidence sliced through his bravado. But the man recovered, spitting on the ground. "We'll see about that." Before it could escalate, another voice called out from behind the biker. "Hey, Cobra. Come on, man, Jax wants to talk to you." A second biker had emerged from the bar doorway, arms covered in tattoos. He frowned at the tension in the air, then sized up Anderson. He clearly noticed something in Anderson's demeanor that made him cautious. "Let's go," the second biker insisted again, more firmly. Cobra glared at Anderson, then gave a derisive snort. "Watch your step, newcomer," he said, tossing the chain over his shoulder. "We own this town." Anderson said nothing, but the hardness in his gaze spoke volumes. He held eye contact until the bikers turned away and stalked back toward Red Charlie's. Only once they disappeared did he allow the faintest exhale to escape his lips. The tension in his muscles thrummed like a coiled spring. These men were amateurs compared to what he'd faced overseas, but they were still dangerous. He slipped back to his car, mind whirling. Jax was around here, probably inside the bar. Good to know. But confronting them outright on their turf with who knew how many inside was reckless. He needed a clearer plan. As he drove off, a cluster of storm clouds gathered on the horizon, darkening the edge of the sky. Perhaps a real storm was rolling in. It felt fitting to Anderson. War was like that, building quietly until the skies opened up and unleashed fury on everyone below. The Iron Fist had no idea the caliber of man they were provoking. And Anderson, for his part, was ready to show them how real warriors handled a threat. The only question was how many lines would be crossed before the final confrontation arrived, and how many innocent people might be caught in the crossfire. A chill settled in the pit of Anderson's stomach at the thought of the entire town becoming a battleground. He had promised he would not let that happen. But standing on the brink, he recognized that once conflict started, controlling its course was often impossible. He would do his best to limit the damage and protect those who needed it. Yet deep down, he knew the Iron Fist was pushing this town to its limit. And when men of violence collide, rarely is the outcome clean or simple. He stared straight ahead, hands firm on the steering wheel. A single phrase echoed in his mind. "They destroyed my father's wheelchair. Now they're going to pay." 2 days later, David Sr. was discharged from the clinic and returned home in Anderson's borrowed sedan. Though still stiff and sore, he insisted on sleeping in his own bed. The drive back had been quiet, father and son both preoccupied with the precarious situation at hand. That evening, as dusk settled over Bridgewater Falls, Anderson helped his father get situated on the living room couch. David Sr. grimaced when he shifted, a reminder of just how forceful those bikers had been. Despite the pain, a certain fire lit in his eyes whenever he recalled their brutality. "Got everything?" Anderson asked, placing a glass of water and some pain meds on the side table. "Yeah," David Sr. sighed. "I'll manage." Anderson nodded, scanning the windows. The small house felt slightly vulnerable. Anyone passing by could see the lights on in the living room. He'd already triple-checked the locks, tested the phone lines, and ensured a loaded cell phone sat within easy reach. Watching him, David Sr. chuckled. "You know, I used to be the one doing that, checking the perimeter, making sure everything was secure. Old habits die hard." Anderson gave a small smile. "Guess I got it from you." For a moment, they lapsed into silence. Then David Sr. spoke softly. "What's your plan?" Anderson paced by the front window. "First, keep you safe. Second, get the iron fist out of this town or behind bars. If the sheriff can't do it, I will. Preferably without a shootout, but we do what we have to." David Sr. nodded. "I don't want you going off half-cocked, son. War is never clean. You do what you need to do, but don't lose yourself in the process." Anderson's gaze fell on his father. "I've seen enough war not to romanticize it. Trust me, I'm not looking for a fight, but I won't let them terrorize you or anyone else." He flicked off the main light, leaving only a small lamp to illuminate the living room. Then he rolled a chair to a spot near the window so he could watch the street. It would be a long night, but he'd done far more grueling stakeouts in desert outposts. However, the night passed uneventfully. No motorcycles roared up the street, no suspicious figures circled the house. Dawn broke with the sound of birds singing, a sharp contrast to the threat looming over them. By mid-morning, Anderson left his father in the care of Emma, who dropped by with groceries and homemade soup. He set out on foot, determined to learn more about the Iron Fist's routine. The town's main drag was lined with small businesses, many with "help wanted" or "closed" signs in the windows, an economic downturn exacerbated by the gang's presence. Folks were too scared to invest, some had even moved away. Anderson's steps carried him past Red Charlie's again. This time, the bar was closed, or at least the front door was locked and the lights off. 2 bikes were still parked near the side alley, though. Probably some members sleeping off a hangover inside. He continued down the street, crossing into a seedier part of town near the old warehouse district. That's when he spotted a large, dilapidated building with a faded sign, Boykin Textiles. The wide loading dock was blocked off by a chain-link fence. A battered black van sat near a side entrance, along with several motorcycles. Even from a distance, he could make out the Iron Fist insignia on the vests of 2 men leaning against the fence. So this must be their clubhouse, he thought. He slowed his pace, pretending to fiddle with his phone while keeping them in his peripheral vision. The men chatted idly, occasionally puffing on cigarettes. One repeatedly checked something on his own phone. Another biker exited the warehouse carrying a cardboard box, set it down, and rummaged inside. Anderson couldn't tell what it contained, but the men's postures suggested some kind of contraband, maybe stolen goods, maybe something else. Anderson mentally marked the location, counting the bikes. He saw 4 in total, plus the van. A single door led into the warehouse from that side, possibly more entrances around the back. No windows on the second floor, likely boarded up to keep out prying eyes. He walked on, making a wide loop to see if he could spy any other vantage points. A high brick wall surrounded the rear of the warehouse. 2 more bikers stationed there. That made at least 6 men on site, possibly more inside. This was a substantial presence, more than just a couple of small-town bullies. A creeping sense of foreboding tightened Anderson's stomach. Storming a place like that on his own was practically suicide. He needed more than just personal skill, he needed at least some measure of backup or a plan to flush them out. He thought about calling in a favor from old Navy contacts, but that might risk his career, not to mention the labyrinth of red tape. Alternatively, he could encourage the state police to raid the place, but they'd need concrete evidence of felony operations. And that could take time, leaving his father in danger. As he circled back toward the main street, deep in thought, a voice startled him. "Hey, you lost." He turned, hand instinctively dropping near his waist, ready for a fight. But he found himself face to face with a man about his own age, wearing the uniform of a local deputy. The name Ag read D. Parker. Anderson forced a polite expression. "No, I'm just walking." Parker eyed him. "You're David Anderson's kid, right? The Navy guy." "That's me." The deputy's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Sheriff Crenshaw said you might be poking around. Look, I appreciate that you want to protect your father, but you can't go wandering near the warehouse. It's dangerous." Anderson studied him. "So that's where they hang out, right?" Parker nodded reluctantly. "Yeah. We've had a handful of calls from folks complaining about noise, fights, suspicious activity, but nothing that's stuck in court. They're real careful about covering tracks. We can't do anything without a warrant or probable cause." Anderson suppressed a frustrated sigh. "What if I told you I saw them handling what looked like stolen goods?" The deputy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder, then leaned in. "I'm not saying I'd ignore that, but we can't just storm the place based on a hunch. We need actual evidence. Pictures, testimony, anything solid. And that's tough to get when they've got watchers posted 24/7. Anderson's mind spun with possibilities. "So they're always on alert?" Parker nodded. "Pretty much. They run in shifts, keep a lid on their real activities. Occasionally they flaunt it, like attacking your father, but that's intimidation. They pick targets they don't expect to fight back." Anderson's jaw tightened. "Until now." The deputy raised a brow. "Right? I get the feeling you're not like the others they've messed with." "No," Anderson agreed quietly. "I'm not." The deputy glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I'll be honest. Some of us in the department are fed up, but we need airtight evidence. The sheriff can't keep requesting SWAT teams for every suspicion. Politics, budgets, you name it. The higher-ups want a guaranteed conviction if they're gonna risk a raid." Anderson nodded, storing that info away. "Any idea what's in those boxes they move around?" "No clue, but it's big enough that they're definitely dealing. Drugs, weapons, stolen property. We just can't prove it." Parker's expression hardened. "Look, if you want to help, maybe gather evidence. Pictures, records, anything. Then we can move." Anderson considered the suggestion. On a combat tour, infiltration and intelligence gathering were standard procedure. Still, it was dangerous. "I'll see what I can do." Deputy Parker patted him on the shoulder, a note of urgency in his voice. "Just be careful, man. If they catch you snooping, they won't hesitate to hurt you or your father. They already took out their anger on him once." Anderson's eyes smoldered. "That won't happen again." After the deputy walked away, Anderson stood in place for a few moments, letting the information settle. They needed evidence. Fine. He gathered it carefully. He was used to stealth ops, though it had been in foreign countries. Doing it stateside might be trickier, with laws to consider, but he'd figure it out. He spent the rest of the day making subtle inquiries around town. Shop owners, a few local teenagers, even the postman, people who might have noticed the gang's patterns. Most were too afraid to talk. Some offered tidbits, like hearing loud noises late at night from the warehouse or seeing out-of-state trucks pulling in. But no one had anything concrete. As dusk approached, Anderson decided to return home to check on his father. On the way, he passed Emma's restaurant. The lights were on and a couple of tables were occupied. He paused, deciding he could grab some dinner and ask Emma if she'd seen any more bikers harassing her customers. The bell over the door jingled as he entered. Emma, wiping down the counter, looked up with a bright smile that quickly morphed into relief. "Anderson, how's David doing?" "He's okay," Anderson replied, taking a seat at the counter. "Resting. Thanks for looking after him." She waved a dish rag dismissively. "Nothing he wouldn't do for me. Can I get you a plate?" "Kitchen's still open." "Sure. Whatever's on special." Emma nodded and relayed the order to the cook. Moments later, a waitress brought Anderson a cold glass of water, and he took a long drink, letting the day's stress settle. A few minutes passed, then Emma leaned over the counter, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard the Iron Fist has been prowling again. You see any of them today?" Anderson hesitated, not wanting to alarm her. Nothing worth worrying about, he said carefully. But I did see them near the old textile warehouse. Emma let out a shaky breath. I remember when that place was still operating. Times sure have changed. She fiddled with the corner of a napkin. We used to feel so safe in this town. Now folks hardly want to come out after dark. Anderson placed a reassuring hand over hers. I'm working on it, he said simply. She smiled, watery gratitude in her eyes. I know you are. Everyone appreciates it. Then she quickly stood upright as the waitress slid a steaming plate of meat loaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans in front of him. Thanks, Anderson murmured, his appetite modest but present. He forced himself to eat, aware that he needed to maintain his energy. While he ate, Emma served the remaining patrons, occasionally flashing him a comforting glance. Halfway through his meal, the bell above the door jingled again. A hush fell as two bikers sauntered in, both wearing iron fist patches. One had a braided beard that reached halfway down his chest. The other was the man called Cobra, recognized instantly by the chain draped across his shoulder. The color drained from Emma's face, but she forced a polite smile. Evening. Table or counter? Braided Beard smirked, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Anderson. For a split second, shock flickered. He recognized him from the scuffle outside Red Charlie's. Then his lips curled into an unpleasant grin. Counter's fine, he said, ambling over with exaggerated swagger. Cobra followed. They sat 2 seats away from Anderson, deliberately leaving a seat between them as if to box him in on one side. Anderson continued cutting his meat loaf, outwardly unperturbed. Internally, he prepared himself for trouble. The other customers avoided eye contact, some quickly paying and leaving. Emma cleared her throat nervously. What can I get you? Coffee, Braided Beard said. No sugar. Cobra tapped the countertop. Same. Emma moved to fill 2 mugs, hands trembling slightly. Anderson ate in silence. He could feel their eyes boring into him, waiting for some sign of fear or aggression. Years of training allowed him to remain calm, his breathing steady. He took another bite of mashed potatoes. Braided Beard drummed his fingers on the counter. That's a nice appetite you got, he remarked, voice loud enough for the room to hear. Most people lose their appetite when we show up. Anderson didn't pause. I'm not most people. Cobra let out a sharp bark of laughter, slapping Braided Beard on the arm. He's got spunk, that's for sure. Must be the soldier boy in him. Emma discreetly slid the coffees over. Both bikers ignored her, focusing on Anderson. A drawn-out moment passed, tension coiled like a viper. Finally, Braided Beard leaned in, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. You're that Navy SEAL, right? The old man's kid. Heard about you. Heard you've been sniffing around places that don't concern you. Anderson finished chewing, dabbed his mouth with a napkin. This town concerns me, he said calmly. That includes any trouble that might affect my father. Cobra tugged at the chain. Your father got what was coming to him. Old cripple should have kept his head down. Every muscle in Anderson's body tensed, but he kept his face neutral. Your boss the one who taught you to pick on disabled veterans? Braided Beard shot out a hand, gripping the edge of Anderson's plate. You watch your tone, he growled. Jax runs things around here, and if you're smart, you'll mind your own business. We don't want to hurt you unless we have to. Anderson let the silence stretch, making sure he had his emotions under control. Then he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. If you or your friends come near my father again, it'll end badly for you. That's not a threat. It's a fact. Cobra and Braided Beard exchanged glances. A flicker of uncertainty crossed their features as if they sensed the real danger hidden behind Anderson's calm exterior. But bullies never liked backing down publicly. Cobra sneered, pointing a finger inches from Anderson's face. Big talk. You'll regret that. Anderson met his gaze without blinking. Try me. For a moment, the restaurant felt like a powder keg waiting for the spark of a single word or gesture. Emma hovered behind the counter, wide-eyed, silently begging for the confrontation to dissipate. The other customers either pretended not to watch or stood half-frozen, ready to run. Finally, Braided Beard let out a low hiss. Cobra, let's roll. Coffee's garbage anyway. He shoved the mug away, sloshing liquid on the counter. Cobra shrugged, spitting on the floor for good measure. Keep that seat warm, soldier boy. We'll be seeing you. With one last glare, they both pushed off their stools and headed for the door. The moment they left, Emma set her hands on the counter, exhaling a trembling breath. That was scary. She glanced at Anderson, worry etched on her face. Are you all right? Anderson nodded, finishing his last bite. Yeah. Sorry about the mess. She waved it off. Better a few spills than a fight. He offered her a quiet smile, then stood and laid money on the counter. Keep the change. And thanks for the meal. She looked at the cash, realized it was more than the cost, and gave him a grateful, if anxious, nod. Please be careful. Anderson gave a short nod and left. Outside, dusk had settled into evening, the sky a dark purple canopy. In the distance, he could hear the receding growl of the bikers' engines. He wondered if they were heading straight to Jack's with news of this confrontation. He didn't relish a fight, but he wouldn't run from one either. For his father's sake and for the sake of all the townspeople, he was ready. The gang was used to scaring folks into submission. But intimidation only worked on those who allowed themselves to be intimidated. Anderson had faced too many real threats in war zones to be cowed by common thugs. Still, he knew violence could erupt at any moment. It pressed on his mind like an impending storm, the air heavy with anticipation. He'd made it clear he wouldn't back down. Now, the Iron Fist would have to decide if they truly wanted to escalate. In the back of his mind, he replayed the conversation with Deputy Parker. If push came to shove, Anderson wanted legal leverage. He needed evidence. Sooner or later, the gang would slip up, and when they did, he'd be ready. He returned home to find his father dozing on the couch, TV flickering quietly in the background. Anderson gently draped a blanket over him and took a seat nearby, letting the muffled late-night news anchor fill the silence. Outside the window, the darkness was thick, any shape on the street just a vague silhouette. He kept watch, mind alight with possibilities. They won't stop, he thought. Not until someone forces them to. The anchor's voice droned on about national politics, traffic reports, and celebrity gossip. It felt surreal listening to mundane updates while living in the shadow of a personal conflict that could explode any minute. Anderson rubbed the back of his neck, tension coiling there. Finally, he clicked off the TV and peered at his sleeping father. Soft snores indicated a deep, if uneasy, rest. The lines on the older man's face seemed deeper than ever, stress compounding the lingering pain. Anderson felt a flare of anger toward Jax and his men. They'd caused this suffering, this sense of vulnerability in a once proud soldier. And for what? A memory flickered of his father teaching him to shoot a .22 rifle in a clearing behind their house years ago. David Sr. had stood tall then, the weight of Vietnam's scars hidden behind a steady presence. He'd always told his son, never start a fight, but if you're in one, you finish it. Anderson pressed his lips into a hard line. This fight, he thought, I will finish. But the shapes of how it would finish remained uncertain. He could only be sure of one thing: the Iron Fist would regret ever laying a hand on David Anderson Sr.'s wheelchair. The faint rustle of wine through the trees outside whispered like a harbinger of coming unrest. Anderson stood guard, eyes scanning the stillness, waiting for the next move in a game neither side intended to lose. The quiet tension felt like a thundercloud, growing heavier with each passing moment. And when that first crack of lightning finally struck, the storm would break, unforgiving, unstoppable. The phone on the coffee table vibrated, shattering the hush. Anderson grabbed it, heart thumping. A text message. The number, unknown. Meet me behind Red Charlie's at midnight. Alone. I have info on the Iron Fist you'll want to hear. Don't show up, you'll regret it. Anderson stared at the screen, questions swirling. A trap? Or a genuine lead? Time was running out and he had to decide which risk was worth taking. The storm clouds continued to gather. And behind them, the promise of a reckoning loomed large over Bridgewater Falls. Anderson reread the text on his phone at least 3 times, trying to glean nuance from each letter. Meet me behind Red Charlie's at midnight. Alone. I have info on the Iron Fist you'll want to hear. Don't show up, you'll regret it. The words felt like a double-edged blade, either a genuine lead or a cunning trap. One thing was certain: whoever sent it believed they held valuable information and could force Anderson's hand. He stood in the dim living room, father asleep on the couch, the hush of the night pressing in on him. His father stirred, blinking awake. "Son," David Sr. rasped, "everything okay?" Anderson pocketed the phone. "Fine," he lied by omission. "Just need some fresh air." He crouched beside the couch, placing a gentle hand on his father's shoulder. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll be careful." David Sr. yawned, but worry shadowed his eyes. "Going out this late? Be sure you come back in one piece." Anderson nodded, then grabbed a jacket from the coat rack. Hidden in the inside pocket was a compact, legally owned handgun, his quiet insurance if things went south. As he stepped onto the porch, the crisp night air prickled his skin. Clouds hung low across the moon, rendering the street dark and still. He headed toward Red Charlie's on foot, wanting to keep a low profile. The bar sat on the rougher edge of town, a place where the last street lamps sputtered weakly at the corner. Neon lights in the windows blinked in erratic patterns, advertising cheap beer and half-priced wings. At 5 minutes to midnight, he circled the block. The front of Red Charlie's was shuttered for the night, with a closed sign pressed against the inside of the grimy glass door. Yet from somewhere within, music played faintly, evidence of after-hours activity. Anderson moved carefully along the side alley, watching every shadow. The stench of stale beer and rotting garbage curled his nose. Behind the bar, a strip of empty asphalt led to a sagging chain-link fence. Dim light spilled from a single overhead lamp, buzzing with insects. A battered dumpster loomed in the corner, and next to it, a single figure in a hooded jacket. The figure's posture suggested tension. He kept shifting from foot to foot. Anderson approached slowly, letting his footsteps fall with deliberate softness. The figure jerked around at his approach and exhaled breath visible in the cool air. A man's face came into partial view, pale, sweaty, with worry lines etched deep. "You're alone?" the man demanded, voice hushed but frantic. Anderson nodded, stopping a few feet away. "I'm here." "Who are you?" The man pulled down his hood. "Name's Charlie. I'm a part-time bartender here." His eyes darted from side to side. "They don't know I'm talking to you." Anderson's expression remained unreadable, though his heartbeat quickened. "What's this about?" Charlie swallowed hard. "Look, I don't want trouble, but I can't keep my mouth shut anymore. Those iron fist creeps use the bar sometimes. They've been hauling boxes in and out after hours. Stuff that looks expensive and not exactly legal." He took a shaky breath. "I heard you're ex-military or something, that you're trying to stand up to them." Anderson folded his arms. "Go on. I overheard them talking about your father. They said something about making an example of him if you didn't back off. His eyes flicked around. "They're planning a bigger shipment soon. Might be guns or worse. If you want to catch them in the act, it's happening in 2 days at the old textile warehouse." Anderson clenched his jaw, absorbing the information. "You're sure about the date and location?" Charlie's voice wavered. "Swear on my life. They brag about it when they're drunk, and I overheard Jax telling one of his lieutenants that everything will be moved out of that warehouse soon, like they're getting ready for a big sale or a big move. If you or the cops want to bust them, that's when to do it. Midnight, 2 days from now." Anderson studied the trembling bartender, trying to judge sincerity. The man seemed genuinely terrified, likely more fearful of the iron fist than of lying. "Why risk telling me?" A rueful smile twitched on Charlie's lips. "They wrecked my place once. I own a share in this bar, and they treat me like trash. Extorting me, racking up tabs they never pay, threatening to burn down the building if I complain. I want them gone." His voice cracked. "But I'm not brave enough to do anything direct. So, I reached out to you." Anderson's gaze shifted to the scuffed asphalt as he turned over possibilities. An inside tip about the upcoming shipment could be the break he needed to gather solid evidence, enough for the sheriff or state police to act. But it could also be a trap if Jax suspected that Charlie would betray them. He refocused on Charlie. "All right, I'll take this under advisement. If you're lying, or if this is a setup." "I'm not lying," Charlie blurted, voice tinged with desperation. "But if they find out I told you, I'm a dead man." Anderson regarded him calmly. "Then keep your head down. I'll handle it." Charlie exhaled, relief and terror mingling in his eyes. "Thank you. Be careful." With that, Charlie hurried away, disappearing into the gloom behind the dumpster. Anderson scanned the perimeter for any watchers, then silently retraced his steps out of the alley. The night swallowed him as he moved, each footstep measured, ears straining for the growl of a hidden motorcycle engine or the click of a cocked pistol. But nothing stirred except the incessant hum of that flickering street lamp. At home, he entered quietly so as not to wake David Sr., though the older man was wide awake and upright the moment the door opened. Couldn't sleep, his father explained, flicking the lamp on. Everything all right? Anderson set aside his jacket. Might have a lead on when the gang's moving their goods. In 2 days, he summarized the encounter with Charlie, noticing how his father's expression hardened at the mention of more threats. That's our chance, David Sr. murmured, though his posture slouched with a renewed burden. If you can expose them, maybe we can get the law to intervene. Anderson nodded. I'm thinking the same, but I also need a plan. I can't just charge in or I'll spook them or get myself killed. His father's gaze flicked to the old wheelchair in the corner, then back to Anderson's face. You've done infiltration ops in war zones. This is right up your alley. Anderson's expression turned grim. Yes and no. Over there, I had my teammates, advanced gear, air support if needed. Here, it's just me. He paused, then his eyes narrowed. Still, I won't let that stop me. David Sr. smiled faintly. You always were stubborn. He reached out, squeezing Anderson's arm. Just don't do anything reckless. I won't, Anderson promised, though a steely determination glinted in his eyes. He could almost hear the distant thunder of the confrontation rolling in, unstoppable as a tide. Try to get some rest, Dad. I'll look into next steps. While his father settled back onto the couch, Anderson moved into the small den. He pulled a battered notepad from a drawer, laying out bullet points. New intel, shipment at the warehouse in 2 days, midnight. Objective, gather evidence, photos, video to supply to sheriff or state police. Risk, potential ambush if Iron Fist suspects infiltration. His gut twisted with the knowledge that once the gang realized they were compromised, they might lash out, potentially targeting his father. That meant time was short. If this tip was legit, the best chance to take the Iron Fist down was during their big operation. If it was a trap, he'd have to be ready for anything. And so, with the midnight hush settling over Bridgewater Falls, Anderson made a silent vow. In 2 days, he would shine the brightest light on the Iron Fist's darkest dealings. Their reign of intimidation would not go unchallenged. A sudden buzzing startled him. He reached for his phone, expecting a text from Charlie. Instead, the caller ID showed an out-of-state number he recognized immediately. It was from a former SEAL teammate. Heart pounding, he wondered if someone else had discovered his predicament or if an old favor might come calling at the worst possible time. Unsure, he picked up. Hello? A tense pause, then the voice on the other end spoke, calm yet urgent. Anderson, I heard rumblings you're in trouble. Got a moment to talk? Anderson stepped onto the front porch, closing the door softly behind him so his father wouldn't hear the conversation. Moonlight shone pale on the empty street. He held the phone close, scanning the darkness for any sign of prying ears. Chase? Anderson recognized the voice immediately. Chase Norwood, one of the closest friends he'd had on the teams. They'd served together on high-stakes raids in the Middle East, forging a bond that ran deeper than blood. On the other end, he heard a low chuckle. You remember. Good. How you been, brother? Anderson's jaw tightened, remembering the reason for the call. I'm managing. I bet you are, Chase said, his tone shifting to concern. Word travels even among guys out of the service. I heard your dad got roughed up by some outlaw bikers. That right? Anderson glanced at the quiet windows of his father's home. It's more than that. They attacked him, destroyed his wheelchair, threatened the town. I'm trying to handle it. A brief silence, then Chase spoke again, voice edged with anger. We protect our own. You need a hand. Anderson inhaled, recalling how the sheriff had cautioned him not to go vigilante, yet also acknowledging that local law enforcement alone might not be enough. You offering? It's not just me, Chase replied. I can pull a couple of the old squad guys who owe me favors. Nothing official, no fancy gear, but men you can trust. If it's a matter of life and death. Anderson felt a rush of gratitude. I can't deny I could use the backup. But it's risky. This is civilian turf, and I don't want you guys in legal trouble. Another short pause. We'll keep it discreet. Plus, we're not planning on waging war. Just offering an extra set of eyes and muscle if it comes down to that. You say the word and we'll be there. Anderson exhaled, tension easing for the first time in days. The prospect of having even a handful of trained operators on his side changed everything. All right, if you can get here within 2 days, there's a big supply run the gang's planning. Might be our chance to shut them down. Chase's voice bristled with quiet excitement. I'll reach out to the guys. Text me an address. We'll coordinate from there. They exchanged a few more details, then hung up. Anderson slipped his phone into his pocket, gazing at the starless sky. Having backup wasn't just about brute force, it meant he could plan a real operation, gather intel properly, and coordinate an ambush on the Iron Fist's illegal shipment. A small knot of worry twisted in his stomach about how the sheriff would react. But local law enforcement could either take the resulting evidence and make arrests, or they could arrive mid-bust if everything lined up. The key was to avoid civilian casualties and keep his father safe. He stepped back inside to find David Sr. awake, his wheelchair squeaking as he maneuvered from the couch to get water in the kitchen. The older man's brow furrowed when he saw Anderson. Phone call at this hour? Anderson nodded. An old friend from the team's offering help. His father's eyebrows lifted in mild surprise. You said yes. I did. We can't handle this alone, Dad. David Sr. rolled the chair closer, leaning his forearms on the table. Is that wise? I don't want a vigilante posse scaring the whole town. Anderson placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. They're professionals, Dad. We know how to operate quietly. All we need is enough evidence to bring the Iron Fist down and protect you and the rest of Bridgewater Falls. David Sr. rubbed his forehead, torn between relief and apprehension. I trust your judgment. Just make sure it doesn't turn into a bloodbath. Anderson nodded. That's the last thing I want. His father swallowed, then patted Anderson's hand. Okay, then let's get some rest and figure out our next steps. Though David Sr. returned to the couch, Anderson stayed up late, scribbling out potential strategies. He mapped the old warehouse district from memory, marking vantage points, potential ambush sites, and possible egress routes. Memories of past missions filtered through his mind, each scenario slightly different from the last. Here, the stakes felt more personal. He wasn't just dismantling a threat for Uncle Sam, he was protecting family. Morning arrived with subdued sunshine peeking through the blinds. Emma dropped by to bring fresh groceries. She and David Sr. chatted quietly in the kitchen while Anderson stepped onto the porch to call Sheriff Crenshaw. The phone rang several times before the sheriff's gruff voice answered. What is it? Crenshaw sounded tired, as if he'd been juggling too many small-town crises. It's Anderson, he said. I've got intel that the Iron Fist is moving illicit cargo out of Boykin Textiles in 2 nights. Probably midnight. Might be guns. A pause. How'd you hear that? A local source. I can't reveal the name yet for their safety. Crenshaw let out a slow breath. And you're sure about this? Anderson's gaze swept the street. I'm sure enough. You said you needed evidence to justify a bigger response. This might be your shot. Another pause. All right, Crenshaw said at last. I'll speak with the state police. Maybe we can set up a surveillance. But we need probable cause, pictures, recordings, something to show a judge. Anderson's jaw tightened. Working on that. In the meantime, can you at least have units on standby near the warehouse? I'll see what I can do, Crenshaw replied. His tone suggested he was wary of placing too much faith in a vague tip. But if you're thinking of waltzing into that warehouse, don't. Let the professionals handle it. I understand, Anderson said, voice neutral. Just be ready for my call. If I catch them in the act, it's now or never. The sheriff muttered something noncommittal, then hung up. Anderson pocketed his phone, uncertain whether Crenshaw would truly mobilize. He felt a mix of frustration. Why did bureaucracy so often favor caution over decisive action? Inside, Emma was bidding farewell to David Sr. I'll drop by tomorrow, David. If you need anything, just call. She paused, then gave Anderson a nervous nod. They're still roaming around, you know? Saw 2 bikers pass by my restaurant this morning, scowling at the window. Anderson tensed. They give you any trouble? She shook her head. No. But it felt like a warning. They're letting us know they're still watching. He inhaled slowly. 2 more days, Emma. With luck, they'll be gone for good after that. She offered a wan, hopeful smile. I pray you're right. After Emma left, Anderson settled next to his father in the living room. I've got to prepare for tomorrow night, he said. Chase and a couple of guys will arrive soon. I'll fill them in, then we'll plan how to do this quietly. David Sr. nodded. You need me to do anything? Just stay put. I don't want you anywhere near that warehouse. If something goes wrong, I need you safe. His father's mouth quirked in reluctant agreement. All right, but I hate sitting on the sidelines. Anderson gently squeezed his father's shoulder. I know. Your job is to be ready if I call. Maybe from home you can call the sheriff if we need immediate backup. David Sr. exhaled. Deal. They spent the afternoon double-checking the house's security. Anderson showed his father where he kept an extra phone in case lines went down, along with a small wooden chest containing important documents. Every detail hammered home the gravity of what might come. This was not just a random scuffle with local punks, it was shaping up to be a large-scale takedown of a gang that had entrenched itself in town. By early evening, the rumble of a pickup truck out front drew Anderson to the door. He recognized Chase's hulking silhouette in the driver's seat, broad shoulders, cropped hair, and a face lined with equal parts humor and danger. Behind him sat two more men, also XSCALS, Rourke and Diaz. Anderson's heart lifted at the sight. Their bond was forged in the crucible of war. If they were here, he had true allies. He waved them inside, introducing them quietly to his father. David Sr. shook each of their hands, offering a half-smile. Thank you for coming. We wouldn't let a brother handle this alone, Chase said simply, setting a small duffel bag on the floor. From within, he retrieved binoculars, a DSLR camera, and a few other discreet surveillance tools. They gathered in the living room, the old coffee table serving as a planning surface. Anderson laid out a rough hand-drawn map. All right, here's the layout of Boykin Textiles. Fence perimeter, main entrance on the east side, loading dock on the west. The Iron Fist typically posts lookouts here and here. He tapped two corners of the sketch. We suspect a large shipment tomorrow at midnight. Diaz, lean and quiet, studied the map. What's the plan for infiltration? Anderson explained the local law enforcement angle. We want evidence. If we can photograph them loading or unloading illegal contraband, that should be enough for the sheriff or state police to make arrests. Maybe we can even tip them off in real time. But we have to be careful. If the Iron Fist sees us snooping, they'll scatter or open fire. Rourke, a stocky man with an ever-present grin, nodded. So we're doing recon from a distance, gather proof, then call in the cops? That's the idea, Anderson replied, unless they start a firefight. Then we defend ourselves and subdue them until the sheriff arrives. Chase thumbed through the camera's settings. We can set up vantage points on the neighboring rooftops if they're accessible. Diaz and I can handle that. Rourke can be your backup on the ground. You direct us as needed. David Sr. watched the coordination with a mix of admiration and anxiety. He'd seen smaller, less planned raids in Vietnam that ended in carnage. Be sure you leave no chance for them to slip away, he cautioned. Bullies like that flourish if they think they can outrun the law. Anderson's expression hardened. We'll corner them. But I also want to limit collateral damage. The building's old. If bullets start flying, watch for hazards. They spent hours refining the plan, analyzing possible pitfalls. By the time they finished, the sky outside had turned a deep indigo, stars muffled by drifting clouds. With the strategy set, they shared a quick meal of soup that Emma had left behind and then parted to get rest. Diaz and Rourke bunked in a spare room while Chase claimed the couch with a sleeping bag. Anderson checked on his father, who insisted on dozing in his bedroom. Yet Anderson himself struggled to sleep. He sat in the den, back propped against the wall, mind humming with 1,000 ifs and whens. The Iron Fist had proven their cruelty was not limited to property damage. They'd physically assaulted a disabled veteran. If cornered, they might retaliate fiercely. He recalled glimpses of Cobra braided beard, that monstrous leader Jack's visions swirling in his head. He pictured them brandishing guns, loading them into crates, or perhaps trafficking something even more dangerous. The hours ticked by. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he drifted into a restless half-sleep. His dreams were jumbled. Desert firefights, father's wheelchair twisted on the sidewalk, old war buddies leaping from a helicopter. Each flash jolted him awake again. When dawn finally arrived, his eyes were gritty with fatigue, but adrenaline quickly chased away the exhaustion. Today was the day before the storm. By this time tomorrow night, it might all be over, either the gang locked away or the situation spiraling out of control. He rose to check on his father, who was already awake, shifting in the squeaky spare wheelchair as he made coffee. "Morning, Dad." David Sr. gave him a wan look. "Big day, huh?" Anderson just nodded, accepting the mug of coffee. In the living room, Diaz was setting up the camera tripod to test it. Rourke was scrolling through local news channels to see if any mention of the Iron Fist had surfaced. Chase quietly inspected his gear, a subdued calm in his eyes. They had one final day to prepare. One last sunset in a relatively peaceful Bridgewater Falls. After that, the midnight confrontation would test everything: their skill, their nerve, and their resolve to protect an old Vietnam veteran who had never wanted another war. While Anderson rinsed his coffee mug, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was the bartender, Charlie, his text message reading. "Saw them bring in a new crate to the bar. Not sure what's inside, but Jax is in a bad mood. He asked about you specifically and your father. Watch your backs." The mid-morning sun crept over the rooftops, lengthening the shadows in David Sr.'s yard. Anderson, Chase, Rourke, and Diaz gathered outside to inspect the immediate vicinity. They wanted to ensure the Iron Fist hadn't stationed any watchers or planted any traps near the property. Fortunately, the street looked quiet. A few townspeople ambled by, exchanging curious glances at the group of athletic men gathered on the lawn. Diaz crouched near the hedge at the edge of the property, scanning for footprints or tire marks. "No sign of recent activity," he reported softly. Chase, standing by the porch, nodded. "Good. Means they're not tailing you. Yet." Inside, David Sr. stirred sugar into his coffee, thinking about the text from Charlie. "Jax is in a bad mood," he muttered, voice carrying to the front door. "That usually spells trouble." Rourke stepped inside to join him. "Any idea why Jax fixates on you and your son so much?" David Sr. set the spoon down, frustration lacing his tone. "Bullies always want to crush what stands up to them." The moment David refused to apologize for just existing in his wheelchair, Jax saw it as a challenge to his so-called authority. Rourke's expression hardened. "Then we'll show him what real authority looks like." Across the yard, Anderson guided Chase into the den where they had pinned up a large map of the warehouse district. He pointed to a tall building about 50 yards away from the Boykin Textiles facility. "This is our vantage," Anderson said. "From its roof, you can see the loading dock and any vehicles coming in. Diaz will set up the camera there, try to capture them with crates or guns in hand." Chase folded his arms. "What about me? I want you on an adjacent rooftop, higher if possible. Act as overwatch with binoculars. Keep an eye on the perimeter. If they send out scouts, or if they try to flank from the rear, you can warn us." Chase's lips twisted into a small grin. "We used to call this the Eagle's Nest approach. Good times?" Anderson's mouth lifted faintly at the memory of past operations. Then his expression sobered. "Rourke and I will be on the ground. We'll find cover behind a row of abandoned boxcars near the side fence. Once we see them unloading contraband, we call the sheriff and move in quietly, cornering them until backup arrives." "Understood," Chase said, eyes flicking to the door. "We'll do a final check of comms tonight." He patted a handheld radio clip to his belt. They'd all brought short-range radios for instant communication, an advantage over the cell phones that might lose signal or run out of battery under stress. They reconvened in the living room to finalize the timeline. David Sr. watched with an anxious pride as these men, professionals, systematically planned to protect him and his town. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he'd faced in Vietnam, where plans often unraveled in the heat of battle. The calm, thorough approach comforted him, the worry still gnawed at his gut. After lunch, the group did a drive-by of the industrial area, careful to remain inconspicuous. Anderson drove Emma's car, with Diaz in the passenger seat snapping photos of the warehouse from a distance. In the back, Rourke kept an eye out for tailing motorcycles. They circled twice, confirming vantage points and finalizing the best parking spot for a quick infiltration at midnight. "All quiet," Diaz remarked as they headed back. "Maybe too quiet." Anderson pursed his lips. "They're playing it cool, waiting for the big move." Back at the house, they found David Sr. in his wheelchair, poring over an old yearbook from the Vietnam Veterans Association. He snapped it shut when they entered, a pensive look on his face. "Used to think this place was so safe," he murmured, eyes distant. "Now I'm the reason armed men are scouring the city." Anderson leaned over, placing a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. "You're not the reason, Dad. They are." His father forced a smile. "I appreciate that. But do me a favor, see this through. Don't let them terrorize anyone else." A heavy hush blanketed the room as each man silently affirmed that mission. They spent the afternoon double-checking their gear, camera, radio sets, non-lethal options such as zip ties and pepper spray. They wanted minimal bloodshed. Yet each also carried a personal firearm. They were not naive about how quickly a standoff could escalate. As evening fell, Emma appeared at the door, a worried line on her brow. "I just closed the restaurant. Thought I'd bring you some supper," she said, holding up a casserole dish. "Figured you might be busy tonight." David Sr. wheeled over. "Emma, you're a saint." She offered a tight smile. "Just be careful." At the table, the small group ate in a subdued silence. The casserole was good: chicken, cheese, vegetables, but anxiety made every bite taste faintly of dread. David Sr. tried to lighten the mood with a story from his youth about outrunning a stray bull on a distant farm, but the laughter fell short, overshadowed by the impending confrontation. After dinner, Emma quietly excused herself. Anderson walked her to her car, scanning the street. "We'll handle this, Emma." She nodded, tears of relief and fear bright in her eyes. "I know. Just come back safe." Once she drove off, Anderson returned inside, where the others were gearing up. The plan was set for midnight. They'd leave the house around 11, park near the industrial zone, and slip into position by 11:30. David Sr. would remain at home, ready to phone the sheriff the moment they had actionable evidence. Meanwhile, Anderson would call the sheriff directly when the evidence was indisputable. All too soon, the clock in the hallway chimed 11 times. The men exchanged glances. It was time. Anderson knelt by the couch where his father Saturday. "We'll be back," he said firmly. "Lock the doors, keep the phone close." David Sr. nodded, pressing a trembling hand against his son's arm. "Good luck." The group stepped onto the porch. The night air was crisp, a half-moon lurking behind a thin veil of clouds. Each man's posture was taut with readiness. They loaded into the pickup truck that Chase had brought, stowing gear carefully in the back. The drive through Bridgewater Falls was eerily calm, no traffic, no flashing lights, only the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional bark of a distant dog. They parked in a side street half a mile from the warehouse district. From there, they proceeded on foot. The deserted sidewalks glowed under flickering street lamps. Diaz and Chase split off, taking a parallel route that would lead them to the rooftops. Anderson and Rourke moved quietly through a narrow alley, heading for the rear of Boykin Textiles. When they reached the vantage point behind a row of rusted boxcars, they crouched low, scanning the area. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the moonlit sky. Faint lights glowed through the high windows, and the echo of raised voices drifted on the breeze. Anderson pressed the transmit button on his handheld radio. "Eagle's Nest, check in." A crackle, then Chase's calm voice. "In position. Diaz is setting up the camera." Another voice, "Diaz. Eyes on the main loading dock. I see a couple of bikes and a black van. Counting 6 or 7 men outside so far." Anderson suppressed a surge of adrenaline. "Copy. Rourke and I are behind the boxcars near the side fence. We'll inch closer soon." Minutes ticked by, each second a creeping eternity. The Iron Fist thugs occasionally trudged in and out of the loading area, shifting crates or rolling equipment. The hush of the night was punctuated by the scrape of wood on concrete or the clang of metal. At 11:50, a pair of motorcycles rumbled into the lot, adding 2 more men to the count. Anderson's radio crackled. "Diaz here. Movement near the rear entrance. They're bringing out a larger crate now." His pulse quickened. "Eagle's Nest, try to get footage." "Zoom in." Chase responded, "We're on it." "Stand by." A few tense moments passed. Anderson and Rourke peered over the top of a rusted boxcar. They could see the side of the building, lights illuminating a forklift carrying a wooden crate onto the loading dock. Half a dozen bikers stood around, arms folded, some glancing at their phones. Finally, Anderson thought, we might get the proof we need. He keyed the radio again. Eagle's Nest, see anything that indicates weapons or contraband? Diaz's reply crackled back. Yes, they just opened the crate. Looks like rifles, definitely not legal. I'm seeing at least a dozen. Trying to get it on video. Anderson's heart thundered. This was it, the evidence that could bring the gang to justice. Make sure it's clear. Once we have enough, we call the sheriff. But before they could proceed, a new development froze Anderson's blood. A large figure stepped into the floodlight near the dock, Jax. He stood with an air of authority, scanning the perimeter. Then, in a chilling gesture, he pulled his phone from his vest pocket and made a call. Anderson strained to hear, but the voice was too far. Jax paced back and forth, then barked something to the men. Two bikers peeled away, heading around the side of the warehouse, directly toward the fence near Anderson's position. Rourke, Anderson whispered, we've got incoming. They ducked behind the boxcar, flattening themselves against the rusted metal. Footsteps crunched on gravel a dozen yards away. Anderson forced slow breaths, praying the darkness kept them hidden. On the radio, Chase whispered, heads up, guys. They're scanning the perimeter. The two bikers halted just on the other side of the fence. One lit a cigarette, illuminating the harsh lines of his face. The other cocked his head as if listening for something. Anderson's muscles tensed, hands inching toward his sidearm. Next to him, Rourke's breathing was steady, a testament to combat experience. After a nerve-wracking half-minute, the bikers grunted in apparent boredom and turned back. Anderson let out a silent exhale, but he knew the slightest slip could still blow their cover. He raised the radio to his lips and spoke so quietly it was almost breathless. Eagle's Nest, do we have enough footage? Diaz's voice, still need a clearer shot of them handling those guns. Stand by. Another wave of motion caught Anderson's eye. A pickup truck rumbled into the lot, headlights doused, and two more gang members hopped out, one cradling a shotgun. They conferred with Jax, who pointed at the crate and barked orders. Suddenly, a string of expletives reached Anderson's ears. Where the hell is that bartender? He should have been here with the payment hours ago, Jax yelled. Anderson's mind flashed to Charlie. Had the Iron Fist demanded he deliver money or supplies? If Charlie shows up, he's a dead man. They'd suspect him of leaking info or simply punish him for being late. Anxiety spiked. Chase's whisper cut through the radio static. They're opening the crate fully now. Getting good footage. Yes, we've got them handling the rifles, brand names clearly visible on camera. Relief warred with tension in Anderson's gut. Time to end this. He clicked to a private channel on his phone, calling his father. Dad, it's on. Get the sheriff on the line. David Sr.'s voice quivered with adrenaline. Right away. A moment later, a hushed ring came through. Then David Sr.'s voice returned. Sheriff is mobilizing. He said stay put until they arrive. Anderson ground his teeth. He knew the unpredictability of these raids. Sometimes the cops arrived too late, sometimes too soon. Got it, he muttered, ending the call. Rourke nudged him. Hear that engine? A deeper rumble was approaching another truck. The tension soared. If more gang members arrived, it might become impossible to contain them without a serious shootout. Anderson's radio crackled again. Diaz, voice urgent, this is big. They're loading crates into the black van. Looks like at least 3 or 4 boxes, each full of rifles. If these leave, we lose them. A rush of urgency hit Anderson. We can't let them drive off. He pressed the transmit. Chase, can you do anything to block them from leaving? Chase sounded torn. I've got eyes, but from the roof I can't exactly blockade the road. Anderson's mind raced. If the sheriff didn't arrive soon, the Iron Fist would vanish into the night with enough firepower to wreak havoc on multiple counties. He glanced at Rourke, who nodded. Both recognized that waiting too long meant losing the advantage. Anderson's radio hissed with static, then Diaz's voice. They're almost done loading the van. We're running out of time. Anderson steeled himself, adrenaline pounding. If they moved now, they'd have to take on at least 10 armed bikers. but letting the iron fist slip away with a van full of rifles wasn't an option. Gritting his teeth, he keyed the radio. "Eagle's Nest, get ready. We're going to intercept that van." A silent electric current seemed to spark through the night air as Anderson and Rourke crept closer to the fence line. The black van's headlights flickered on, engine rumbling as the bikers finished loading crates. A tall man with a snake tattoo around his neck, Cobra, was in the driver's seat, tapping the steering wheel impatiently. Next to him, Braided Beard argued with another gang member over the best route out of town. Anderson's radio crackled. "Diaz here. The sheriff's not here yet. We gotta stall them." "I know," Anderson whispered, scanning for the easiest point to slip under or over the fence. He spotted a weak section where the chain link was damaged. Nudging Rourke, he pointed. With minimal noise, the two used a folding multi-tool to pry the links apart just enough to squeeze through. Once inside the perimeter, they advanced in a half-crouch, using the darkness and the stacked crates for cover. The forklift was still parked near the loading dock. Jack stood beside it, barking orders to a cluster of bikers. The old warehouse lights cast long shadows on the ground, stretching the menacing silhouettes. Suddenly, the radio popped again. "Chase, eyes on a squad car approaching from the west, single unit. Looks like just one deputy." Anderson clenched his jaw. That had to be Deputy Parker or another brave soul, but one squad car against a dozen gang members was nowhere near enough. The typical tangle of red tape had probably delayed the rest of the response. They were on their own for the moment. He pressed the talk button softly. "Diaz, Chase, cover us from above. We'll move on the van. We can't let them roll out with those rifles. Once we make contact, give us covering radio calls. If they aim guns at us, be prepared to engage from your vantage points." A quiet double-click from Chase signaled acknowledgement. Anderson nodded to Rourke, both men steadying their firearms ready to confront heavily armed criminals if necessary. They eased around a stack of crates. 20 yards away, the black van idled, side door open. Unaware of the infiltration, Cobra and Braided Beard argued about something with the side door half ajar, rifles faintly visible inside. Another biker was rummaging in a second crate, presumably verifying the contents. With practiced stealth, Anderson crept behind a low set of pallets until he was only 10 feet from the van's rear corner. Rourke flanked left, taking a position by an overturned barrel. Both men locked eyes, each giving a slight nod. Anderson inhaled, then stepped forward, weapon raised. "Freeze," he bellowed, voice slicing through the night's hush. For an instant, the entire lot went still, as if the world held its breath. Cobra spun in the driver's seat, eyes wild. Braided Beard jerked upright, one hand dropping to the pistol at his belt. 3 other bikers near the van stiffened, uncertain whether to reach for their own firearms or flee. Anderson steadied his aim on Cobra. "Hands where I can see them. Right now." A heartbeat later, chaos erupted. Braided Beard snarled, yanking his pistol free. He fired 2 shots wildly in Anderson's direction, both missed, lodging in crates behind him with muffled thuds of splintering wood. Anderson dove to the side, rolling behind a stack of pallets for cover. Simultaneously, Rourke sprang up, returning fire. One bullet struck Braided Beard's pistol hand, forcing him to drop the weapon with a yelp of pain. Cobra gunned the engine, trying to yank the van into gear, but found himself pinned by gunshots peppering the hood from Diaz's vantage. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off metal. Jax and 2 more gang members sprinted toward the forklift, ducking behind crates. Muzzle flashes lit the night, a staccato of gunfire echoing off the concrete walls. The deputy's squad car screeched to a stop by the main gate, red and blue lights flashing. A single silhouette, likely Deputy Parker, took cover behind the open driver's door, radio crackling. Amid the gunfire, Anderson pressed his radio. "Diaz, keep them suppressed." "Rourke, move on the van." Rourke zigzagged across the open gap, bullets whizzing overhead. One gangster with a shotgun popped up near the loading dock, firing a deafening blast that peppered the boxcar behind them with buckshot. Diaz returned fire from the rooftop, driving the shotgun wielder back into hiding. Cobra revved the van, refusing to surrender. The tires screeched as he tried to peel out. But Rourke, with nerves of steel, dove forward and fired at the front tire. A loud pop signaled a direct hit. The van lurched, wheel flapping uselessly. Sparks flew again as another barrage of bullets slammed into the van's rear panel, Chase providing overhead cover. Cobra cursed, swinging the driver's door open to return fire with a handgun. Rourke ducked behind a rusted barrel, pinned down by the hail of bullets. Anderson repositioned, creeping behind more crates. He spotted Jax about 30 yards away, reloading a rifle. The gang leader's face was a mask of fury as he yelled at his men. Anderson saw the large crate of rifles they'd left on the loading dock, ripe for the taking if the gang reorganized. He had to break their momentum. Gunfights were about controlling the pace, sowing confusion in the enemy ranks. He pressed his radio again. "Diaz, can you see Jax?" Diaz replied, breathless, negative. "He's behind the forklift." "I see movement, though. Someone's heading for the big crate." Anderson peered around a corner. Sure enough, a biker was sprinting toward the crate to presumably grab more rifles. Anderson took careful aim, firing twice. The second bullet struck the ground inches from the man's feet, forcing him to dive aside. He scurried behind a pile of debris, cursing. Deputy Parker's voice echoed from the squad car loudspeaker, shaky but resolute. "This is the sheriff's department. Lay down your weapons." The response was immediate. Another volley of shots rained at the squad car, shattering a headlight. Parker ducked, radioing frantically for backup. Anderson realized the deputy alone wouldn't be able to quell this firefight. A flash from above signaled Chase's sniper-like precision, taking out the front tire on the van's other side. The vehicle sat lopsided now, not going anywhere. Cobra, pinned, finally scrambled out of the driver's seat, hugging the ground behind the engine block for cover. Braided Beard, injured, was cursing and pressing a bandana to his bleeding hand. Anderson advanced carefully, using the confusion to close distance. Bullets ricocheted, the night lit by muzzle flashes. He glimpsed Jax's hulking form. The gang leader had found a vantage behind a steel drum, reloading a rifle with furious speed. "Over here, soldier boy!" Jax bellowed, voice echoing across the lot. "You think you can run this show? Let's see you face me, man-to-man." Anderson's gut tightened. This was the same brute who had destroyed his father's wheelchair and threatened to break him. A wave of anger surged, but he forced it down, focusing on the mission. He spotted Rourke pinned behind a half-wall near the forklift, exchanging fire with two gang members. Chase's voice crackled in Anderson's earpiece. "We've got at least 4 tangos still armed and shooting. I can see Jax. He's trying to coordinate them. I have a shot, but it's not clean." Anderson recognized the risk of letting Jax slip away. The Iron Fist's ringleader was the key to the entire operation. If Jax managed to escape, the gang might reorganize elsewhere. Summoning a surge of determination, Anderson gestured for Rourke to cover him. Then he pivoted around the corner, sprinting across open ground. Gunfire sparked around him, one bullet grazing a crate to his right, sending splinters across his face. He ignored the sting, sliding behind the forklift just as Jax opened up with a short burst from his rifle. Sparks pinged off the steel frame, and Anderson had to duck low. Heart pounding, he pressed his radio. "Diaz, if you can flush Jax to the forklift, I can take him down." From above, Diaz unleashed a flurry of suppressing shots that forced Jax to abandon his vantage point. The gang leader cursed, scurrying closer to the forklift for cover, which brought him right into Anderson's line of sight. Before Jax could react, Anderson rose, weapon aimed. "Drop it!" Jax bared his teeth in a feral grin, swinging his rifle. Anderson fired once, hitting Jax's shoulder. The big man roared in pain, staggering. But with terrifying ferocity, he lunged forward, grabbing the forklift's metal guard to steady himself. His rifle clattered away, but he still had a massive combat knife strapped to his vest. Time seemed to slow as Jax yanked the knife free, lunging at Anderson. Instinct propelled Anderson into a sidestep, parrying Jax's slash with the barrel of his weapon. They crashed into the side of the forklift, the clang of metal reverberating. The smell of sweat and gunpowder filled Anderson's nostrils. Jax swung again, the blade whistling past Anderson's abdomen. Years of close-quarters combat training kicked in. Anderson trapped Jax's wrist, twisting it violently. A snarl contorted Jax's face, his thick muscles straining. Despite the bullet wound in his shoulder, he fought with frightening strength. Back and forth they grappled, each seeking an advantage. Anderson slammed an elbow into Jax's gut. The big man grunted, momentarily winded, then headbutted Anderson, rattling his vision with a burst of white light. Pain blossomed in Anderson's forehead. They stumbled apart, panting. Jax swayed, blood soaking his sleeve from the gunshot wound. Yet his eyes burned with rage. "You're gonna pay for messing with me, messing with the Iron Fist." Anderson steadied his stance, ignoring the trickle of blood down his temple from the headbutt. "You already hurt my father," he said, voice trembling with anger. "That was your biggest mistake." He feinted left, drawing Jax's attention, then pivoted right with a swift strike to Jax's wounded shoulder. The gang leader howled, dropping the knife in agony. Anderson capitalized on the opening, locking Jax's arm behind his back and sweeping his leg out. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, forklift looming overhead. Anderson pressed a knee into Jax's back, forcing him flat. The big man struggled, but his strength was ebbing as blood loss took its toll. Beyond them, the firefight had dwindled, the gang members either pinned or surrendering under the watchful aim of Rourke, Chase, and Diaz. Sirens wailed in the distance. Finally, law enforcement reinforcements were arriving. Anderson panted, pressing down to keep Jax pinned. "You're done," he muttered. Jax spat on the ground, chest heaving. "This isn't over," he growled. "We have connections you can't imagine." Anderson ignored the threat, twisting Jax's arm until the big man gasped in pain. "Keep talking," he hissed. "It won't change a damn thing." Deputy Parker and a second patrol car barreled into the lot, red and blue lights illuminating the carnage. As Parker rushed toward them, cuffing a wounded braided beard, the distant rumble of several more bikes could be heard. Reinforcements for the Iron Fist, perhaps? Anderson, still restraining Jax, glanced up in alarm at the new threat rolling into the chaos. The fresh roar of motorcycle engines echoed across the industrial zone, sending a shiver of dread through Anderson. He remained atop Jax, knee pressed into the gang leader's spine. "Rourke, heads up," he shouted, scanning the perimeter. The battered black van was still idling, tires shredded, with Cobra pinned behind the engine block. Rourke turned in time to see 5 new bikers screech into the lot. Their headlights carved bright beams through the swirling dust. One of them brandished a long-barreled firearm, an AR-15 or something similar. The law enforcement backup was still trickling in, only 2 squad cars on site. The newly arrived Iron Fist members could tilt the odds back in their favor. "Chase, Diaz?" Anderson barked into his radio. "We need you to suppress those bikes now." High on their respective rooftops, the 2 XSCALs pivoted to address the fresh threat. Muzzle flashes lit the sky as they laid down precise fire, aiming to disable the approaching motorcycles. Sparks danced off concrete. One biker skidded sideways, losing control of his bike and flipping over the handlebars. Another veered wildly to avoid the hail of bullets. Meanwhile, Deputy Parker and a second officer crouched behind their squad cars, shouts crackling through the night. "Drop your weapons. Surrender." Most of the original Iron Fist members were disarmed or wounded, but the new arrivals had come in hot. One of them hopped off his bike, firing rounds toward the police vehicles. Bullets dinged off the hood of a squad car, forcing the officers to duck. Anderson tightened his grip on Jax's arm. The gang leader let out a savage growl, thrashing underneath. Desperate to break free, Jax twisted violently, nearly unseating Anderson. But a sharp elbow to Jax's kidney made him grunt and go still, momentarily subdued. He pressed his radio. "Rourke, can you cuff this guy? I need to assist the others." Rourke sprinted over, zip ties in hand, ignoring the bullets whizzing overhead. In seconds, they had Jax's wrists secured behind his back, though he kept spewing curses and threats. "When my boss hears about..." "Shut it," Rourke hissed, leaving Jax face down on the asphalt. Anderson leapt up, weapon ready. The new bikers had begun a frenzied firefight with the rooftop snipers and the cops. The van, riddled with bullet holes, coughed black smoke from its engine. Cobra, battered and cornered, tried to crawl away. Braided Beard was writhing on the ground, still clutching his wounded hand. A surge of protective fury coursed through Anderson. These men had terrorized his father, threatened his friends, and now they were doubling down with even more violence. "No more." He darted forward, hugging the side of a shipping container for cover. Shots rang out, one bullet ricocheting an inch from his face. Diaz radioed in, "They're trying to flank the cops. I'll handle the one with the AR." Another flurry of shots echoed from the rooftop. Anderson peeked around the corner to see that the shooter's barrage had forced one of the new arrivals to dive behind a stack of tires, effectively pinned. A second biker, brandishing a handgun, sprinted toward Cobra's position, likely hoping to free him or help him flee. Anderson charged from behind the shipping container, tackled the man in a headlong collision. They tumbled across the gravel, the biker's pistol clattering away. They wrestled, fists swinging. The biker landed a blow to Anderson's ribcage, making him gasp. But Anderson retaliated with a sharp right hook, stunning the man. He quickly pinned him, slapped on another zip tie, and rolled away. 3 down, 2 to go among the new arrivals. The radio crackled, "Chase here, biker at your 9 o'clock, running for the fence line." Anderson glanced over his shoulder in time to see a lanky figure with a bandana scrambling to climb the chain-link fence, possibly trying to loop around and ambush the police. Anderson sprinted in pursuit. Gravel crunched underfoot as he closed the gap. The biker reached the top of the fence. Without slowing, Anderson jumped, grabbed the chain link, and yanked hard. The fence rattled, throwing the man off balance. He toppled backward, crashing onto the pavement with a pained yelp. Anderson landed on him when knocked out of them both. Dazed, the biker reached for a knife at his belt, but a swift elbow to the jaw prevented that. Another zip tie, another neutralized threat. Meanwhile, the last new arrival was pinned down by the police. Deputy Parker, to his credit, had advanced to a better position behind some barrels, commanding the man to drop his weapon. The cornered biker hesitated, eyes flicking around desperately. The realization that his crew was either captured or wounded seemed to register. Finally, he hurled his gun aside and raised his hands, face twisted in bitter resignation. For a few heart-stopping moments, the only sounds were the hiss of the black van's ruined engine and the ragged panting of wounded men. Then, like a breaking wave, the tension snapped. The few remaining bikers who could move got on their knees, hands behind their heads. Police officers rushed in, guns trained, shouting commands. Sirens wailed again, heralding the arrival of more law enforcement vehicles. Anderson crumpled to one knee, exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through his veins. Rourke jogged over, forehead glistening with sweat, gun still drawn. "You good?" He nodded, breathing heavily. "Yeah. We got them all." A grin cracked Rourke's face, relief shining in his eyes. "Looks like it." Across the lot, Diaz and Chase emerged from a side door, having climbed down from the rooftop. Diaz still held the camera, having recorded the entire confrontation. Chase's expression was grim satisfaction. "We have everything on tape: guns, the shootout, them resisting arrest. Plenty of evidence." Deputy Parker and his fellow officer began cuffing the last bikers, reading them their rights. Jax lay on the ground, wound in his shoulder, face contorted in pain and fury. Parker nudged him roughly. "Guess your tough guy act ends here, Jax." Jax spat blood on the pavement, refusing to speak. The next half hour was a blur of activity. Additional squad cars and an ambulance arrived. Medics began treating the wounded, including a few gang members who had gunshot wounds. Braided Beard, still cursing, was loaded onto a stretcher. Cobra glowered, shoulders slumped in defeat. The cops carefully pried open the van's side door, revealing crate upon crate of illegal rifles. Anderson, Rourke, Chase, and Diaz huddled near the forklift. Their role in subduing the gang was obvious, and the police didn't hide their relief. Finally, Sheriff Crenshaw arrived, stepping out of his cruiser with wide eyes. He surveyed the scene: the broken fence, bullet-ridden van, scattered crates, and multiple arrested bikers. Crenshaw turned to Anderson. "Guess you saved us a whole lot of trouble. Or caused a lot of trouble, depending on perspective." Anderson met the sheriff's gaze calmly. "We got them. Caught in the act with a small armory. This should be enough to put them away." Crenshaw nodded, exhaling sharply. "Yes, I believe so." He looked around at the battered industrial lot. "No doubt about it, you took down nearly the entire chapter of the Iron Fist single-handedly." His tone held a mixture of amazement and reproach. "I had a bigger team on the way, but guess you didn't wait." "We couldn't," Anderson replied. "They were about to leave with those crates. If we had, half of them would have escaped." The sheriff gave a slow nod, then clasped Anderson's shoulder. "I owe you a debt. The whole town does." At that moment, Deputy Parker approached. These guns matched the descriptions of stolen military-grade weapons from a raid across state lines. We'll coordinate with the federal folks. Might lead us to bigger fish. Crenshaw turned to the ex-SEAL team. And you all? Are you planning to stick around for the debrief? Chase and Diaz exchanged looks. We'll give statements, Chase said, but after that, we'll probably head out. We didn't come here for credit, just to help a brother. Rourke clapped a hand on Anderson's back. Wouldn't mind a beer or two first, though. Crenshaw waved at them to follow. We'll need your official statements at the station. Then I think the least we can do is buy you all a drink. Anderson's body ached from bruises and the earlier scuffle with Jax. Yet relief buoyed him. The Iron Fist was effectively dismantled in Bridgewater Falls, if not entirely wiped out. A lingering fear nagged at him about Jax's claim of having connections. But for now, the immediate threat was neutralized. As they began filing out of the warehouse lot, paramedics hoisting the injured, a single phone rang, a battered device pulled from Jax's pocket. Parker answered it on speaker. A muffled voice snarled on the other end. You idiots better have those guns ready. The buyer's expecting them up north by tomorrow. If you fail, I'll bring the wrath of the entire network down on you. Everyone froze, including Jax, who lay glaring from the ground. The call ended abruptly. A new wave of tension seized the air. Who was that voice? Had the Iron Fist only been one piece of a larger machine? The final echoes of sirens and rumbling engines faded as the police convoy departed the Boykin Textiles warehouse. Anderson and his companions followed the squad cars to the station, providing official statements about the shootout and their role in subduing the Iron Fist. By the time everything was processed, dawn peeked over the horizon, staining the sky with pale gold. Exhausted, Anderson parted ways with Diaz, Chase, and Rourke at the station's entrance. You guys can crash at my dad's place, he offered, swallowing a yawn. Plenty of floor space. Chase shook his head wearily. Appreciate it, but I think we'll get a motel. Let your old man have some peace. Diaz patted Anderson's shoulder. We'll be around for a day or two if you need us. But it looks like the local cops have it handled now. Anderson nodded, grateful. Thanks, guys. I owe you. They shared a quick round of half-smiles and handshakes, the camaraderie of men who had faced danger together. Then the three ex-SEALs climbed into their pickup and rolled away. Anderson sighed, turning to see David Sr.'s sedan parked near the curb where his father waited, propped in the squeaky spare wheelchair. He crossed to greet him. Dad, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be resting at home? David Sr. gave a tired grin. As if I could sleep. Emma drove me here so I could see you, make sure you were all right. Then she headed to open the restaurant. Anderson crouched beside his father. I'm fine. A little banged up. His father's gaze flicked over the bruises on Anderson's cheek and the dried blood near his temple. Looks like more than a little. But you're alive. That's what matters. They lingered by the curb, the early sun warming their faces. Each breath felt heavier with the knowledge that a big piece of the conflict was resolved. Jax and most of his Iron Fist goons were either wounded or in custody. Yet the memory of that phone call from Jax's device pulsed like a fresh wound. A bigger network. If the Iron Fist was just one arm of a more expansive operation, Bridgewater Falls might still be at risk. Sheriff Crenshaw stepped out of the station, approaching them. Morning, he greeted, nodding to David Sr. I wanted to let you both know that we're holding Jax and his men on multiple charges. The state will likely get involved soon, especially with these stolen weapons. David Sr. frowned. What about that phone call? Crenshaw's expression darkened. We're tracing the number. Could be an affiliate gang or black market contact. Either way, these men have been funneling weapons for a while. There's no telling how many layers exist. Anderson's jaw flexed. They threatened to bring the full network down on us. Are we sure Jax's associates won't seek revenge? Crenshaw tilted his head, eyes narrowing in concern. We can't be certain, but we'll step up patrols, keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. He put a hand on Anderson's shoulder. You've done enough for now, son. Try to get some rest. If we need more from you, we'll call. Anderson wasn't fully reassured, but he nodded. Okay, I'll be at my father's place. Crenshaw forced a reassuring smile. It'll be all right. We'll handle it. With that, he turned back into the station, probably to wade through mountains of paperwork and field calls from the state police. David Sr. and Anderson made their way to the sedan, with Anderson pushing the wheelchair carefully over the cracked sidewalk. The drive home was subdued, both men fighting waves of exhaustion. Once inside the bungalow, David Sr. insisted that Anderson sit down for breakfast, even though it was nearly midday. "Let me at least make some scrambled eggs," he said, moving toward the kitchen. Anderson gently steered the wheelchair away from the stove. "Dad, you rest. I can cook." David Sr. tried to protest, but a sharp pain in his back made him wince. Reluctantly, he relented, letting Anderson handle the simple meal. They ate quietly at the kitchen table. Sunlight bathed the room, everything serene and familiar, yet under the surface, tension lingered. Finally, David Sr. cleared his throat. "So, you think they'll come after us again?" Anderson massaged the bridge of his nose. "I can't say for sure. The immediate threat is gone, but that phone call, it implies there's a larger pipeline. If they're vengeful or protective of their business, we need to stay vigilant." His father nodded gravely. "I was thinking about something last night, about my friend from the Vietnam Veterans Association. He mentioned seeing a surge of organized biker gangs hooking up with cartels, smuggling weapons in different states. If this group is part of that, we might be dealing with a bigger fish than we realized." Anderson absorbed that. "We have to hope the feds follow those leads. Otherwise, we might be forced to take action again." David Sr. set his fork down, looking pained. "I don't want you living under the threat of endless violence. Isn't that exactly what we both wanted to avoid after our wars?" His son's eyes dropped, remembering the vow he'd made to protect his father. "I know. But if they do come, we'll be ready." Exhaustion weighed on them both. They decided to take advantage of the lull, each finding a spot to rest, David Sr. in his bedroom, Anderson in the living room recliner. Hours slipped by. The house was quiet, only the soft hum of an air conditioner. Outside, the day brightened into a normal small-town afternoon. Maybe life would finally return to normal. But normalcy had a way of being fleeting in times like these. Around mid-afternoon, the phone rang. David Sr. picked up, expecting Emma or the sheriff. Instead, a frantic voice spilled over the line. "Charlie, the bartender." David? Is your son there? I need to talk to him now." David Sr. handed the receiver to Anderson, who took it with a concerned glance. "Charlie? What's going on?" A rush of words tumbled out. "They found out, man. They found out I helped you. I got a threatening message on my phone from a number I don't recognize. They said if I don't hand myself over, they'll burn down Red Charlie's, or worse, come after me personally." Anderson's pulse spiked. "Slow down. Who sent the message?" "They claim they're part of the Iron Fist's parent group, some bigger network. My guess is that Jax's phone call had a chain reaction. Word's out that I ratted them out." I'm dead, man." Anderson inhaled to steady him. "You're not dead. The Iron Fist is in custody." Charlie cut him off. "Maybe they had other guys on standby, or maybe it's another chapter. All I know is I can't go to the cops. If I do, they'll just come after me. I need your help." Anderson closed his eyes briefly. The last thing he wanted was to get tangled in more chaos. But Charlie had risked everything to tip them off. "All right, calm down. Where are you now?" "In my basement at the bar. Red Charlie's is closed, but I'm locked in here. I'm afraid to leave. They might be watching." A wave of protectiveness washed through Anderson. "Stay put. We'll come get you." He hung up, squaring his shoulders. David Sr. was already eyeing him with resigned determination. "You're going, aren't you?" "I have to," Anderson said, grabbing his jacket. "He gave us the tip that brought down the Iron Fist. Now he's a target. I can't just let him die." His father looked torn. "Let me come." "No," Anderson said firmly. "You need to stay here. I'll call for backup if needed." David Sr. reluctantly nodded, understanding that his presence could hinder more than help if violence erupted. "Just be careful, son." Anderson leaned down, clasping his father's hand. "I promise." He texted Diaz, Chase, and Rourke. Another threat. Bartender in trouble. Going to Red Charlie's. If you're still in town, meet me there. Then he slipped out the door. The afternoon sun blinded him momentarily as he stepped off the porch. Tension gnawed at his insides. How big was this network? If they already had someone in town to threaten Charlie, who else could be in danger? He drove Emma's car through the quiet streets. People were out shopping, kids riding bikes, as though it were any ordinary day. But Anderson felt a cold pit in his stomach. Danger lurked under the surface, unseen by most. Pulling up to Red Charlie's, he parked discreetly in a side alley. The bar's weathered exterior looked as unwelcoming as ever, neon beer signs unlit. The main door was locked. Anderson circled to the back entrance where he'd first met Charlie. The alley smelled of stale beer and garbage, reminiscent of that fateful midnight rendezvous. He tested the door handle locked. He rapped softly. "Charlie? It's me." A muffled voice from inside. "Coming, Jay, just a sec." Metal scraped as the bolt was unlocked. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Charlie's pale face. Dark rings shadowed his eyes. He pulled Anderson inside, locking the door behind them. The basement was cluttered. Old kegs, a few boxes of liquor bottles, a battered pool table. Charlie pointed to a phone on the bar. The screen displayed a single text. "You helped the vet's son. We know it. You have 1 hour to turn yourself in at mile marker 17 on Willow Creek Road. Come alone or your bar burns with you inside it." Anderson frowned, reading it twice. "This is an obvious trap." Charlie's hands shook. "I know, but if I ignore it, they'll do something horrible. They said they'll burn my bar, maybe kill me anyway." A flood of complicated emotions rose in Anderson. Rescuing Charlie was the right thing to do, but how many times could he wade into danger? He grabbed his phone, messaging the guys again. "Trap at Willow Creek Road, need backup." He turned to Charlie. "We'll handle it. I'll go in your place, maybe flush them out. My friends might meet us there." Charlie paled. "And if your friends don't come? I'll still figure something out," Anderson assured him, though inwardly he shared Charlie's fears. What if Chase and the others had already left town? They'd said they might stick around a day, but no guarantees. Charlie wrung his hands. "I can't let you do that. What if they kill you? This is my mess." Anderson placed a firm hand on Charlie's shoulder. "You did the right thing tipping me off. This is bigger than you. These scumbags want to set an example to show no one can betray them. We're stopping that tonight." A beep sounded on Anderson's phone. A response from Rourke. "We're 5 minutes out. We'll meet you near Willow Creek. Don't do anything rash." Relief unclenched Anderson's chest. "They're coming. Good." He ushered Charlie upstairs, into the main bar area. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon light streaming through filthy windows. "Lock up here, stay hidden in the basement. Don't open that door for anyone but me or the cops." "Got it." Charlie nodded anxiously. "Got it." Minutes later, Anderson climbed into his car, adrenaline coursing anew. The address was mile marker 17 on Willow Creek Road, a lonely stretch of highway winding around farmland. He only hoped Diaz, Chase, and Rourke could intercept him before the confrontation. As he drove out of town, the scenery changed from quaint storefronts to rolling hills dotted with barns. The sky hung low, pale and cloudless, an almost eerie emptiness. The sense of stepping into an ambush thrummed in Anderson's mind. He made sure his sidearm was loaded, checked the small kit in the passenger seat, a few first aid items, spare ammo, a tactical flashlight. Finally, the small green sign for mile 17 appeared. He slowed, scanning the shoulder of the road. A tall oak tree provided limited cover. He parked behind it, engine idling. No sign of the enemy yet. He checked his phone, no new messages from the guys. Heart pounding, he unbuckled and stepped out, scanning the horizon. "Come on, show yourselves," he muttered, hand near his holster. The gentle rustle of wind through the grass was the only reply. Car engine purred in the distance. He tensed, stepping back behind the oak. Then, in the distance, he spotted the glint of chrome. A single black SUV rumbled along the dirt shoulder, approaching cautiously. When it reached about 50 yards away, the vehicle stopped. The engine cut out. Two figures emerged, both wearing black leather jackets. Not the Iron Fist insignia, but some other patch that Anderson couldn't make out. One yelled, voice carrying across the empty air, "We want the bartender. Send him over." Anderson squared his shoulders, stepping into view. "He's not coming. You want him, you go through me." The two men exchanged looks. One spat on the ground. "We're here for payback. You destroyed the local chapter. Now you pay. Our boss wants the bartender's head for betraying the operation." Anderson's adrenaline spiked. "He's under my protection," he said, voice steady. "Leave now or you'll regret it." Tense beat. Then the men lifted handguns, leveling them at Anderson. Fear twisted in his gut, but he refused to falter. He drew his own weapon in a smooth motion, aiming squarely at the one on the left. Before any shot could be fired, a second vehicle roared up behind the black SUV. More armed figures leapt out, numbering at least 4. They fanned out along the roadside, forming a menacing line. Outnumbered, Anderson held his ground, uncertain if his allies would arrive in time, or if he just walked into a lethal noose he couldn't escape. Anderson's mind whirled as he gauged the new arrivals. 6 men total now, all armed, their posture signaling a readiness to kill. He recognized none of the patches on their jackets, but it was clear they belonged to something bigger and more organized than the small-town Iron Fist chapter. The closest figure, a tall man with a scar under his eye, sneered, "You must be the hero who took down Jax. The boss said you'd be trouble." Anderson kept his pistol level. "Last chance. You want to walk away? Do it now." Scarface laughed, the sound carrying a dangerous edge. "You might take a few of us down, but we'll put you in the dirt. We're not leaving without the rat bartender, or your corpse." A cold calm settled over Anderson. He had faced worse odds in war zones, but never alone. He prayed Diaz, Chase, and Rourke were close. Each second felt like an eon. One of the men yelled, "Enough talk!" He opened fire, bullets kicking up dust near Anderson's feet. Instinctively, Anderson dropped behind the trunk of the oak tree, returning 2 quick shots. One found its mark, striking the man's shoulder and spinning him to the ground with a shriek of pain. The rest scattered, taking up positions behind the SUV or the ditch at the roadside. Gunfire echoed across the farmland. Anderson pressed his back against the tree, inhaling raggedly. He was pinned. A bullet chipped bark inches from his head, showering him with splinters. He risked a glance around the trunk, firing a quick volley. The shots forced one man to duck, but didn't connect. They had him outnumbered and flanked. Another minute of this and they'd close in. Then, from the opposite side of the road, a new voice rang out, "Drop your weapons! Now!" Anderson's heart soared. Chase. The cavalry had arrived. The ex-SEAL's commanding shout was punctuated by a hail of bullets ripping into the SUV's rear tire. The vehicle sank on its rim, tilting. Rourke and Diaz advanced from behind a cluster of trees, firing controlled bursts that pinned 2 attackers in the ditch. Suddenly, Anderson had a window. He whipped around the oak, aiming at Scarface, who now faced a 2-front assault. Scarface tried to spin and fire on Chase, leaving himself open. Anderson squeezed the trigger, a single shot that struck Scarface in the leg. He collapsed with a guttural roar. Sensing the tide turning, another attacker scrambled for the SUV's front seat, possibly to flee. Diaz put 2 bullets in the hood, disabling the engine. Smoke hissed from under the crumpled hood. The man cursed, bailing out. Rourke moved in swiftly, forcing him to surrender at gunpoint. Amid the cacophony, one last defiant gunman hurled a Molotov cocktail from behind the SUV, launching it at the cluster of trees where Chase hid. The flaming bottle exploded against the trunk, engulfing the foliage in sudden fire. Chase dodged back with a yelp, batting away embers that singed his jacket. Anderson recognized the danger. If that fire spread, they'd have no cover. He aimed at the Molotov wielder, but the man was already rearing back for another throw. Another flaming bottle soared. This one landed near Anderson's oak tree, igniting tall grass in a whoosh of orange flame. Smoke stung Anderson's eyes. Shots rang out from Diaz's position, and the Molotov wielder staggered back, dropping the half-lit rag. The bottle shattered at his feet, flames licking hungrily at his boots. He screamed, stumbling, then tumbled into the ditch, frantically rolling to extinguish the fire. Rourke, ignoring the flames and smoke, charged forward. He tackled the last standing aggressor, grappling him to the ground. Chase emerged from behind a smaller tree, coughing from the smoke, gun raised. The battered enemies recognized they were beaten. One by one, they dropped their weapons, clutching wounds or trembling with fear. Within moments, the only sound was the crackle of small fires in the grass and the ragged breathing of the combatants. Anderson stepped into the open, scanning for any threats still standing. None. The 6 men lay or kneeled on the roadside, either wounded or subdued. Diaz waved smoke from his face, eyes watering. "Everyone okay?" Chase patted at a scorch mark on his sleeve. "I'm fine. A little crispy, but fine." Rourke secured a zip tie around the ankles of the flailing Molotov thrower, who was shrieking about his burnt foot. "We need to call the fire department before this spreads," he said, glancing at the smoldering grasses. Anderson exhaled, adrenaline coursing through him. "I'll do it." He dialed 911, quickly notifying dispatch about the roadside fire and the armed confrontation. As he ended the call, he locked eyes with Diaz. "Thanks for coming when you did." Diaz offered a tight smile. "We told you we'd have your back." They gathered the enemy's weapons in a pile. Scarface groaned, pressing a bloody hand to his leg wound, cursing them in an unknown accent. Another of the attackers glared, refusing to speak. The rest moaned and whimpered. Firefighters arrived first, dousing the small roadside fire before it could escalate. Then more squad cars rumbled up the highway. Sheriff Crenshaw hopped out, face drawn in shock. "You guys again? Are you okay?" Anderson nodded, stepping back to let the deputies secure the suspects. "They set a trap for the bartender. We intervened." Crenshaw surveyed the bullet-ridden SUV, the scorched grass, and the battered men on the ground. "Seems you intervened thoroughly. These ones part of the same ring." "Looks like it," Anderson confirmed. "They said they were carrying out the bigger network's orders." Crenshaw barked instructions to his deputies, who began cuffing the men and checking IDs. One deputy radioed for ambulances to treat the wounded. Another deputy rummaged in the SUV, pulling out an array of fake license plates and a notebook scrawled with cryptic numbers. It looked like logistical records for smuggling runs. Crenshaw's lips thinned. "This is huge. We might have just stumbled upon a multi-state pipeline. I'll need the feds again." Anderson, exhausted, dropped onto a small boulder near the road. The day was turning out longer than expected. Diaz crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of near-constant combat. "Just tired." Rourke let out a low whistle, glancing at the subdued criminals. "We've definitely kicked the hornet's nest." Chase exhaled, resting against the battered car. "Any more hornets left to come at us?" Anderson shrugged. "If there are, we'll keep swatting them down." Sheriff Crenshaw approached, brow furrowed. "You and your friends are doing the job of an entire federal task force. I'm grateful but also concerned. You guys need to lay low. If this network is as extensive as it seems, they could have more resources." Anderson exchanged glances with his team. "We can't just let them run wild. If they have more operatives out there, Charlie and my father could still be targets." Crenshaw sighed, crossing his arms. "I'll station deputies near the bar, and we'll increase patrols around your dad's place. But I need you to step back. At least let us handle some of this. Every time you engage, you're risking your life, and I don't want vigilante fiascos." Anderson pressed his lips together, tension swirling. He understood the sheriff's position, but stepping back felt risky if the police weren't fully equipped to protect the town. Still, in the last 2 days, he and his father had survived 2 full-scale shootouts. Maybe enough was enough. He glanced at the guys. Chase gave a small nod, echoing a weary agreement. Rourke shrugged. "I'm game for stepping back if the cops are serious about coverage." Diaz rubbed a bruised shoulder. "We'll stick around a bit longer, though, just in case." Crenshaw rubbed the back of his neck. "We have enough evidence to hold these men. My guess is they'll face federal charges. If there's more coming, we'll find them. But for your own sake, keep a low profile." Anderson finally relented with a short nod. "All right, we'll do that. But if you need us, we're here." With that, the tension lifted slightly. Deputies recorded statements. Paramedics loaded the wounded criminals for hospital transport, and the battered SUV was towed away. The once peaceful farmland bore fresh scorch marks and bullet casings. A grim reminder that rural quiet could shatter under the weight of criminal networks. Eventually, the small group parted ways, leaving the scene in Crenshaw's capable hands. Anderson watched the police cars pull away, uncertain if they'd truly seen the last of the biker network's wrath. But for now, the immediate threat was contained. Diaz, Chase, and Rourke accompanied Anderson back to Red Charlie's to retrieve their vehicles. Charlie emerged from the basement, eyes wide with relief when they reported that the threat was neutralized. I don't know how to thank you," he stammered. "Just keep yourself safe," Anderson replied. "Any sign of trouble, call the cops or me." Charlie nodded gratefully. The XSLS parted with him, then headed to the motel to pack their things, suspecting they might finally leave Bridgewater Falls. Anderson drove home alone, heart heavy. He realized just how battered he felt. Physically from the fights, emotionally from the constant vigilance. David Sr. deserved peace. So did the entire town. When he parked at the bungalow, his father was on the porch, squinting at him anxiously. "Everything okay, son?" Anderson climbed out, forcing a reassuring nod. "We took care of another group. The sheriff's on it." David Sr. exhaled, tension flooding from his shoulders. "Good." Anderson joined him on the porch steps, the late afternoon sun slanting across them. They watched a neighbor pass by, giving a friendly wave. Life around them seemed normal again. Kids returning from school, a postal truck making deliveries. David Sr. laid a hand on Anderson's arm. "You've done enough, son. You did what was necessary." A swirling mix of relief and worry tugged at Anderson's chest. "I just hope it's over." That call from the bigger network, it could lead to more trouble if they decide to retaliate. His father nodded. Maybe, but you can't stand guard forever. Sometimes you have to trust that the authorities and the community will stand up for themselves once they realize they can. Anderson mulled over the words, seeing the wisdom in them. The battles he fought overseas taught him that no single soldier could fix everything. Sometimes you empower others to fight their own fights. They sat there quietly, letting the warm rays wash over them. For the first time in days, neither the rumble of motorcycles nor the glare of hostile men disturbed the peace. Perhaps it was a sign that the storm had truly broken, leaving battered survivors in its wake, but also renewed hope. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, Anderson's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You think this is over? Watch your back. Real power moves in silence, and you have no idea who you're dealing with. Anderson's chest tightened. Another shadowy threat, another step deeper into a hidden war. The seeds of dread stirred once again, reminding him that while Jax's chapter lay in ruins, the greater battle might still loom on the horizon. The question remained, could Bridgewater Falls truly find peace, or was this only the calm between storms?